They said it was impossible, a handful of colonies, scattered along the edge of a vast wilderness, daring to challenge the mightiest empire the world had ever seen. The British Empire, upon which the sun never set, commanded the most powerful navy on earth, fielded professional armies that had conquered nations across 3 continents, and possessed wealth beyond imagination. Against this colossus stood farmers with muskets, merchants with no military training, and a ragtag collection of militias that could barely afford uniforms, let alone weapons. The odds were astronomical. Britain had 50,000 professional soldiers. America had none. Britain had the Royal Navy controlling the seas. America had fishing boats. Britain had unlimited credit and the resources of a global empire. America was broke and getting broker. Any rational observer in 1775 would have bet everything on Britain crushing this rebellion within a year, maybe 2 at most. Yet 8 years later, the impossible happened. Those farmers and merchants defeated the British Empire and created a new nation built on principles that would change the world forever. This is the story of how we did it. Not the sanitized version you learned in school, not the myths and legends that have grown over 2 centuries, but the real story, the true story, of blood and sacrifice, of brilliant strategy and catastrophic mistakes, of heroes and traitors, of a revolution that came within a hair's breadth of failure before snatching victory from the jaws of defeat. This is the story of how 13 colonies became the United States of America. This is the story of the American Revolution. Welcome to the fight for independence. Welcome to the true story revealed. The year is 1763. The British Empire stands at the peak of its power. From the shores of India to the Caribbean, the sun never sets on British territory. King George III rules over the mightiest military force the world has ever seen. The Royal Navy controls the seas. British redcoats are feared across every continent. But here, along the eastern edge of a vast wilderness, 13 small colonies are about to do the impossible. They're about to defeat the greatest empire in human history. This is the story of how farmers, merchants, and common men stood against professional armies, how a ragtag group of rebels created a nation that would change the world forever. This is the true story of the American Revolution. To understand how this impossible victory happened, we need to go back to when most colonists still considered themselves loyal British subjects, back to when the very idea of independence seemed like madness. The French and Indian War has just ended. Britain has won a spectacular victory over France, gaining control of virtually all of North America east of the Mississippi River. But this victory comes with a devastating price tag. The war has doubled Britain's national debt to over £130 million, an astronomical sum. The British Treasury is nearly bankrupt, and King George III and his Parliament have a simple solution: make the American colonies pay for their own defense. It seems reasonable to them. After all, British blood was spilled protecting these colonists from French invasion. British money paid for the war. Why shouldn't the colonists contribute? But the colonists see things very differently. For over 150 years, these 13 colonies have governed themselves with minimal interference from London. They've built their own legislatures, passed their own laws, and yes, taxed themselves. The colonial assemblies held the power of the purse. It was an arrangement that worked. Each colony had its own character, its own identity. Massachusetts, with its Puritan work ethic and town meetings. Virginia, dominated by wealthy plantation owners who saw themselves as English gentlemen. Pennsylvania, founded on Quaker principles of tolerance. New York, a bustling commercial hub of different cultures and languages. What united them was a shared understanding of their rights as Englishmen. They believed in representative government. They believed that taxes required their consent through their elected assemblies. These weren't radical ideas. These were traditional English liberties, established over centuries of struggle against royal tyranny. The Magna Carta of 1215 had established that the king couldn't tax without consent. The English Civil War and Glorious Revolution had reinforced these principles. To the colonists, these rights were sacred, won through blood and protected by law. In 1764, Parliament passes the Sugar Act. It's designed to raise revenue by taxing molasses and other imports. Colonial merchants are outraged, but this is just the beginning. The real explosion comes in 1765 with the Stamp Act. This law requires colonists to purchase special stamped paper for virtually everything: newspapers, legal documents, licenses, playing cards, even dice. It's the first direct tax Parliament has ever imposed on the colonies without their consent. The reaction is immediate and violent. In Boston, a passionate lawyer named James Otis gives voice to colonial fury with a phrase that will echo through history: taxation without representation is tyranny. The words spread like wildfire through the colonies. In Virginia, a young lawyer named Patrick Henry rises in the House of Burgesses and delivers a speech so inflammatory that some cry treason. He doesn't back down. The message is clear: if Parliament can tax the colonies without their consent, then the colonists are nothing more than slaves. Throughout the 13 colonies, secret organizations calling themselves the Sons of Liberty begin to form. In Boston, they're led by a failed businessman turned radical agitator named Samuel Adams. Sam Adams is a master of propaganda and street politics. He understands that to resist the Stamp Act, they need more than words, they need action. On August 14, 1765, a Boston mob hangs an effigy of the local stamp distributor from a tree. When authorities try to cut it down, the mob riots. They destroy the stamp office and ransack the distributor's home. The message is clear. Any man who tries to enforce the Stamp Act will face the mob's fury. The violence spreads. In New York, in Charleston, in Newport, stamp distributors are terrorized until they resign. Not a single stamp distributor in all 13 colonies remains in office. The Stamp Act becomes unenforceable. But here's what makes this different from a simple riot or rebellion. The colonial resistance is organized. It's coordinated across 13 separate colonies that have never worked together before. In October 1765, delegates from 9 colonies meet in New York for the Stamp Act Congress. It's the first time the colonies have united for a common political purpose. They draft a declaration of rights and grievances. The language is respectful but firm. They proclaim their loyalty to the crown but assert that only their own assemblies can tax them. They're not rejecting British authority. They're defining its limits. This is a crucial distinction. The colonists still see themselves as British subjects defending traditional British liberties against parliamentary overreach. Back in London, British merchants are feeling the pain. The colonists have organized a boycott of British goods that's devastating to trade. Parliament faces a choice: enforce the Stamp Act with military force or back down. In 1766, they choose to back down. The Stamp Act is repealed. The colonists celebrate wildly. Bells ring, cannons fire, toasts are drunk to King George III. Many believe the crisis is over. They've made their point, and the mother country has listened. Surely now things will return to normal. But they're wrong. On the same day Parliament repeals the Stamp Act, they pass something else: the Declaratory Act. It's easy to overlook in the celebrations, but it's arguably more important than the Stamp Act itself. The Declaratory Act asserts that Parliament has the right to make laws binding the colonies in all cases whatsoever. Think about those words. In all cases whatsoever, no exceptions, no limits. Parliament is claiming absolute authority over the colonies. Most colonists don't pay much attention to the Declaratory Act. They're too busy celebrating the Stamp Act's repeal. But a few sharp minds understand what it means. Men like Sam Adams in Boston and Patrick Henry in Virginia see the danger. The conflict hasn't been resolved. It's been postponed. The fundamental question remains unanswered. Does Parliament have the right to tax and legislate for the colonies without their consent? The British say yes. The colonists increasingly say no. It's a conflict that cannot be compromised. Either Parliament has unlimited authority, or the colonists have rights that limit that authority. There's no middle ground. In 1767, the conflict reignites. Charles Townshend, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, pushes through a new series of taxes on imports: glass, lead, paint, paper, and tea. The Townshend Acts are cleverly designed to avoid the objections to the Stamp Act. These are external taxes on trade, not internal taxes. But the colonists aren't fooled. To them, the principle is the same. It's taxation without their consent. Once again, boycotts are organized. Once again, the Sons of Liberty mobilize. But this time, Britain takes a harder line. They send more troops to enforce the laws and maintain order, especially in rebellious Boston. The presence of British soldiers in American cities changes everything. These aren't distant tax collectors. These are armed men in red coats, standing on street corners, patrolling neighborhoods. Tensions rise daily. British soldiers are poorly paid, and many take part-time jobs, competing with local workers. Fights break out. Insults are exchanged. It's a powder keg waiting for a spark. That spark will come on a cold March evening in 1770, on a Boston street corner. But before we get to that fateful night, we need to understand what's really happening here. This isn't just about taxes or money. It's about identity and principle. The colonists are beginning to see themselves differently. They still consider themselves British, but they're developing a distinct American identity. They've built communities in a harsh wilderness. They've created prosperous societies with their own hands. They've governed themselves for generations. And now, for the first time, they're being told they have no say in their own affairs. For men who pride themselves on their liberty and self-reliance, this is intolerable. The British, for their part, see ungrateful subjects who refuse to contribute to their own defense. They see colonists who enjoy the protection of British power but won't accept British authority. From London's perspective, the colonies exist for the benefit of the mother country. That's the whole point of having colonies. But the colonists have a different view. They believe they're not subordinate subjects, but equal partners in the British Empire. They believe their colonial assemblies are equivalent to Parliament, all united under the Crown. These incompatible visions of empire are on a collision course. Neither side understands the other. Neither side is willing to back down on matters of principle. And so, as the 1760s come to an end, the British Empire and its American colonies are drifting toward a confrontation that will change the world. The seeds of revolution have been planted. They're starting to grow. And soon, very soon, they'll bear bitter fruit that neither side expects. The road to Lexington and Concord, to independence and war, has begun. And there's no turning back. March 5, 1770. Boston is a city on edge. 4,000 British soldiers occupy a town of only 16,000 people. That's one soldier for every 4 civilians. The redcoats are everywhere, a constant reminder of British authority and colonial subordination. The tension between soldiers and citizens has been building for months, and tonight it's about to explode. The evening starts with a simple confrontation. A young wigmaker's apprentice accuses a British officer of not paying his bill. It's a minor dispute, the kind that happens in any city. But in occupied Boston, nothing is minor anymore. A British sentry responds by striking the boy with his musket. The boy runs off crying, and soon a crowd begins to gather. This is how riots start in Boston. A small incident draws onlookers. The onlookers become a crowd. The crowd becomes a mob. By 9 o'clock that night, church bells are ringing throughout the city, the traditional alarm for fire. But there's no fire tonight. The bells bring more people into the streets, confused and alarmed. In the chaos, groups of angry colonists converge on the custom house, where a lone British sentry named Hugh White stands guard. The crowd surrounds him, hurling insults and chunks of ice. White is terrified. He calls for help, and Captain Thomas Preston arrives with 7 soldiers to reinforce him. Preston's men form a semicircle, muskets loaded with bayonets fixed. The crowd swells to over 300 people. They're not backing down. In fact, they're getting bolder, pressing closer to the soldiers, daring them to fire. Someone throws a club that hits Private Hugh Montgomery, knocking him down. Montgomery gets up furious and fires his musket into the crowd. The other soldiers, hearing the shot and fearing for their lives, open fire without orders. The musket balls tear through the crowd at point-blank range. 5 colonists fall. 3 die instantly. Crispus Attucks, a mixed-race sailor and former slave. Samuel Gray, a ropemaker, and James Caldwell, a sailor. 2 more, Samuel Maverick and Patrick Carr, will die from their wounds in the following days. The crowd scatters in panic and horror. Blood stains the snow. The sound of gunfire echoes through Boston's narrow streets. Within minutes, the entire city knows that British soldiers have killed American colonists. The lieutenant governor, Thomas Hutchinson, rushes to the scene. He's desperate to prevent all-out warfare in the streets. He promises the crowd that justice will be done, that the soldiers will face trial. It's enough to calm the immediate crisis, but the damage is done. By morning, Boston is ready to explode. Thousands of armed colonists pour into the city from surrounding towns. They're ready to drive the British out by force. Sam Adams and other leaders of the resistance see their opportunity. They demand that Governor Hutchinson remove all British troops from Boston immediately. Hutchinson doesn't have the authority to do this, but he understands that he has no choice. If the troops stay, there will be a massacre. Both sides withdraw from the brink. The soldiers are moved to islands in the harbor, away from the city. But the political damage is catastrophic for Britain. Sam Adams and his associates immediately begin spinning the event for maximum propaganda value. They call it the Boston Massacre. Paul Revere creates an engraving showing British soldiers deliberately firing on peaceful colonists. It's not accurate. The crowd was hardly peaceful, but accuracy isn't the point. The image spreads throughout the colonies like wildfire. Here's what makes the Boston Massacre so significant. It transforms the conflict from abstract principles about taxation and representation into something visceral and personal. British soldiers killed Americans. That's something everyone can understand. Something that provokes an emotional response in a way that debates about constitutional theory never could. The massacre becomes a rallying cry, a symbol of British tyranny. Every year on March 5th, Boston will hold commemorations, keeping the memory fresh, keeping the anger alive. But there's a complicating factor that reveals something important about colonial America and the men who will lead the revolution. Captain Preston and his soldiers are put on trial for murder, and they're defended by 2 prominent Boston lawyers, John Adams and Josiah Quincy. John Adams is Sam Adams's cousin and already a leader of the resistance movement. He opposes British policy as much as anyone, but he also believes passionately in the rule of law and the right to a fair trial. When no other lawyer will take the case, Adams steps forward, knowing it will damage his reputation and possibly his career. The trial is fair and thorough. Adams argues brilliantly that the soldiers acted in self-defense against a violent mob. He doesn't defend British policy, only the right of these individual men to defend themselves when their lives were threatened. The jury, made up entirely of colonists, acquits Captain Preston and 6 of his men. 2 soldiers are found guilty of manslaughter, branded on the thumb, and released. Think about what this means. In the middle of rising revolutionary fervor, colonial jurors render a fair verdict based on evidence rather than passion. Colonial lawyers defend the enemy in court. This is the kind of society the colonists are building, one based on law rather than arbitrary power. It's one of the fundamental differences they see between themselves and what they view as British tyranny. This commitment to legal principles, even when it's politically inconvenient, will shape the coming revolution and the nation that emerges from it. But while Boston buries its dead and conducts its trials, the larger conflict is not resolved. The Townshend Acts are still in place. The boycotts continue. Trade suffers on both sides of the Atlantic. In 1770, the same day as the Boston Massacre, coincidentally, the new Prime Minister, Lord North, moves to repeal most of the Townshend duties. It's another attempt to defuse the crisis. But North keeps the tax on tea. It's a small tax, just 3 pence per pound, but he keeps it as a matter of principle. Parliament must maintain its right to tax the colonies. The colonists must acknowledge parliamentary authority. It's the same fundamental disagreement that caused the crisis in the first place. For a while, an uneasy peace settles over the colonies. The boycotts slowly collapse as colonists resume buying British goods. Most people want to move on, to return to normal life and profitable trade. Only the most radical elements keep agitating. Sam Adams in Boston forms committees of correspondence to coordinate resistance across the colonies and keep revolutionary sentiment alive, but even he struggles to maintain momentum. Without an immediate crisis, most people focus on their daily lives and businesses. Then, in 1772, Britain makes another mistake that reignites colonial fury. The royal governor of Massachusetts, Thomas Hutchinson, announces that he and the colony's judges will now be paid directly by the Crown rather than by the Colonial Assembly. This might seem like a minor administrative change, but the colonists immediately understand its significance. For generations, colonial assemblies have controlled government salaries. It's their main source of power over royal officials. A governor or judge who defends colonial rights might get a generous salary. One who doesn't might find his pay delayed or reduced. It's a check on royal authority, a way for the people's representatives to influence government. Now the Crown is removing that check. Governors and judges who depend on London for their salaries will serve London's interests, not the colonists. The Massachusetts Assembly responds by establishing a formal committee of correspondence to communicate with other colonies. Virginia follows suit. Soon all 13 colonies have committees coordinating their response to British policy. They're building the infrastructure of resistance, creating networks that will prove crucial when revolution comes. In 1773, the crisis reaches a new peak. The British East India Company is on the verge of bankruptcy, holding massive warehouses full of unsold tea. The company is too important to fail. It's central to British power in India and trade with Asia. Parliament passes the Tea Act to save it. The act actually lowers the price of tea in America by allowing the company to sell directly to the colonies without intermediaries. Colonists will be able to buy tea cheaper than ever before. Parliament thinks this will end the tea boycott and finally establish their right to tax the colonies. The colonists will accept the tax in exchange for cheap tea. But Parliament has completely misread the situation. The colonists don't care that the tea is cheaper, they care about the principle. Accepting taxed tea means accepting Parliament's right to tax them without consent. It means surrendering the very rights they've been fighting for. Moreover, the Tea Act creates a monopoly for the East India Company, cutting out colonial merchants who've been trading tea, albeit smuggled tea. It's bad economics and worse politics. In ports throughout the colonies, the Sons of Liberty mobilize to prevent the tea from being unloaded and sold. In New York and Philadelphia, they succeed in turning the ships away. In Charleston, the tea is unloaded but locked in warehouses unsold. Boston becomes the flashpoint once again. 3 ships laden with East India Company tea arrive in late November 1773. Governor Hutchinson refuses to let them leave without unloading their cargo and paying the tax. The law requires that the tax be paid within 20 days, or the ships and cargo will be seized. Sam Adams and the Sons of Liberty organize mass meetings at the Old South Meeting House. Thousands attend, far more than can fit inside. They're determined that the tea will not be unloaded, will not be sold. The deadline approaches. On the night of December 16th, with no solution in sight, Sam Adams rises at the meeting and reportedly says, "This meeting can do nothing more to save the country." It's a signal. Within minutes, a group of men disguised as Mohawk Indians rushes down to Griffin's Wharf. They're members of the Sons of Liberty, but their identities are hidden. They board the 3 ships, and over the next 3 hours, they methodically break open 342 chests of tea and dump them into Boston Harbor. It's remarkably disciplined. They damage nothing else on the ships. They harm no one. They're making a point, not starting a riot. When they finish, 46 tons of tea worth nearly 10,000 pounds is floating in the harbor. The Boston Tea Party, as it will come to be known, is a calculated act of defiance and destruction of property. The reaction in Britain is swift and furious. Even many British politicians who sympathized with the colonies are outraged. You don't destroy property worth 10,000 pounds and expect no consequences. King George III himself is determined to make an example of Boston. Parliament passes a series of laws that the colonists will call the Intolerable Acts. The Boston Port Act closes Boston Harbor until the destroyed tea is paid for. The Massachusetts Government Act revokes the colony's charter and puts it under direct royal control. The Administration of Justice Act allows royal officials accused of crimes to be tried in Britain rather than in the colonies. The Quartering Act requires colonists to house British soldiers in their homes if necessary. These laws are designed to isolate and punish Massachusetts, to show the other colonies what happens when you defy British authority. But the strategy backfires completely. Instead of isolating Massachusetts, the Intolerable Acts unite the colonies in opposition. They see that what's happening to Boston could happen to any of them. If Britain can revoke Massachusetts' charter, no colony's rights are safe. In September 1774, 12 colonies send delegates to Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress. Only Georgia is absent. These men are the elite of colonial society, wealthy planters, successful merchants, prominent lawyers. Most are conservative by nature, not radicals or revolutionaries, but they're united in believing that Britain has gone too far. The Congress debates for weeks. Some want to find a compromise, to petition the king for redress of grievances and return to the happy relationship that existed before 1763. Others, particularly the Massachusetts delegates, believe that time for compromise has passed. In the end, they take a moderate but firm position. They issue a Declaration of Rights asserting that the colonies have the right to govern themselves in their internal affairs. They organize a Continental Association to enforce a complete boycott of British goods, and they agree to meet again in May 1775 if their grievances aren't addressed. They're not declaring independence, they're not rejecting the king, but they're drawing a line. Back in Massachusetts, the situation deteriorates rapidly. General Thomas Gage, the British military commander, is now also the royal governor. He has 4,000 troops in Boston, but the countryside is an open rebellion. Colonial militias are drilling on town greens. Weapons and ammunition are being stockpiled. The colonists call themselves Minutemen, ready to fight at a minute's notice. Gage receives orders from London to arrest the rebel leaders and seize their weapons. He knows this will trigger a violent confrontation, but he has his orders. He begins planning a raid on Concord, where the colonists are storing military supplies. The date is set, April 19, 1775. The seeds of revolution, planted in the 1760s and watered with blood in 1770, are about to bear their final fruit. The shots that will be heard round the world are about to be fired, and once they are, there will be no going back. April 18, 1775. Boston is an occupied city, surrounded by a hostile countryside. General Thomas Gage commands the most powerful military force in North America, but he's isolated and nervous. His spies have reported that the colonial rebels are stockpiling weapons and gunpowder in Concord, a small town about 20 miles northwest of Boston. Gage has his orders from London: seize those weapons and arrest the rebel leaders, particularly Sam Adams and John Hancock, who are hiding in Lexington. Tonight, he's sending 700 of his best troops to do exactly that. It's supposed to be a secret mission, but in Boston there are no secrets. The colonial spy network knows about the raid before the soldiers even assemble. As darkness falls, British troops begin gathering at Boston Common. They're light infantry and grenadiers, the elite soldiers of the British Army. They've been ordered to travel light and fast, to reach Concord before the rebels can hide their weapons. But across the Charles River, watchful eyes are already tracking their movements. Dr. Joseph Warren, one of the leaders of the Boston resistance, has been expecting this. He sends 2 riders to warn the countryside, Paul Revere and William Dawes. They take different routes in case one is captured. In the steeple of the Old North Church, 2 lanterns are hung, the prearranged signal that the British are coming by sea across the river rather than by land across Boston Neck. Paul Revere reaches Charlestown by boat and mounts a horse. He rides hard through the night, stopping at every house and tavern along the way. His message is simple and urgent: the regulars are out. Within minutes of his passing, church bells begin ringing and signal guns firing. The alarm spreads across the countryside faster than the British troops can march. Farmers grab their muskets. Minutemen assemble on town greens. By midnight, the entire region knows that the redcoats are coming. Revere reaches Lexington around midnight and warns Sam Adams and John Hancock. William Dawes arrives shortly after, having taken the longer land route. Together with a 3rd rider, Dr. Samuel Prescott, they continue toward Concord. But British officers patrolling the road capture Revere and Dawes. Only Prescott escapes to warn Concord. The British column, under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith, is moving slower than planned. The troops had to wait for boats to cross the river, then wade through a marsh in the darkness. They're cold, wet, and tired, and they're increasingly aware that their secret mission is no longer secret. They can hear alarm bells ringing in every direction. Smith sends a messenger back to Boston requesting reinforcements, but he continues forward. He has his orders. In Lexington, Captain John Parker musters about 70 Minutemen on the town green. These are farmers and craftsmen, not professional soldiers. Some are old men, some are teenagers. They've been waiting for hours in the cold night air. Some have gone home to warm up, others to taverns. As dawn breaks and news comes that the British are close, Parker reassembles his men. He faces an impossible decision. Does he actually intend to fight 700 British regulars with his 70 militiamen? Or is this a symbolic show of resistance? According to later accounts, Parker tells his men, "Stand your ground, don't fire unless fired upon. But if they mean to have a war, let it begin here." The sun is just rising when the British advance guard, led by Major John Pitcairn, reaches Lexington Green. The Redcoats are exhausted from their night march, but they're professional soldiers facing amateur militiamen. Pitcairn orders the colonists to lay down their arms and disperse. He doesn't want bloodshed here. His mission is in Concord, not Lexington. Captain Parker, seeing that he's vastly outnumbered, orders his men to disperse. They start to leave, but they don't lay down their weapons. What happens next is confused and disputed to this day. Someone fires a shot, nobody knows who. It might have been a British soldier, might have been a militiaman, might even have been a spectator, but once that first shot rings out, others follow. The British soldiers, tired and nervous, begin firing volleys into the dispersing militiamen. It's over in minutes. 8 Americans lie dead on Lexington Green, 10 more are wounded. Only 1 British soldier is slightly injured. It's not a battle, it's barely even a skirmish, but it's everything. The war for American independence has begun with that first shot, the shot heard round the world. The British troops reform and march on to Concord, leaving the dead and wounded behind. In Concord, the colonial militia has had time to hide most of their military supplies. When the British arrive around 8 in the morning, they find the town nearly deserted. Most of the population has fled or hidden. The soldiers search buildings and find some weapons and supplies, which they destroy or throw into the river. 3 companies are sent to secure the North Bridge on the edge of town. Several hundred Minutemen from Concord and surrounding towns gather on a hill overlooking the bridge. They watch smoke rising from the town and believe the British are burning Concord. In reality, the smoke comes from supplies being burned, not buildings, but the militiamen don't know that. They see their town apparently being destroyed and decide to act. Colonel James Barrett gives the order to advance toward the bridge. He tells his men not to fire unless fired upon. The British companies at the bridge, seeing several hundred armed colonists marching toward them, pull back across the bridge and prepare to defend it. As the Americans approach, nervous British soldiers fire warning shots. Then they fire a volley into the advancing colonists. 2 Americans fall dead. This time the Americans fire back. It's the first time in the entire conflict that colonial militiamen have fired on British soldiers under orders from their officers. It's not a mob, not a riot, it's military action. The British troops at the bridge are overwhelmed by superior numbers. 3 soldiers are killed, 9 wounded. They retreat in disorder back toward Concord Center. Colonel Smith, the British commander, realizes his mission has failed. He hasn't found many weapons, and now he has armed colonists gathering in large numbers. He orders a retreat back to Boston. The march back becomes a nightmare for the British troops. The colonial militiamen don't fight like European armies. They don't form lines and volley fire. Instead, they use tactics learned from fighting Indians. They hide behind walls, trees, and buildings, firing from cover at the marching column. Every stone wall might conceal a musket. Every bend in the road might hide an ambush. The British soldiers, trained for European-style warfare, are helpless against these tactics. The retreat turns into a running battle that stretches for 16 miles. Militiamen from dozens of towns pour in from all directions. By noon, nearly 2,000 colonial fighters are harassing the British column. The Redcoats are running low on ammunition. Men are falling wounded or dead. The column is on the verge of complete collapse. Then, at Lexington, they're saved by British reinforcements. Lord Percy has marched out from Boston with 1,000 fresh troops and 2 artillery pieces. The cannon fire clears the surrounding area, giving the exhausted soldiers a chance to rest and reorganize. But the respite is brief. As soon as the column resumes its march, the fighting begins again. The British soldiers are furious and terrified. They're being killed by an enemy they can barely see, an enemy that doesn't fight by the rules. In their rage and fear, they commit atrocities. They shoot civilians, they burn houses, they bayonet wounded men. These acts of violence will be remembered and used as propaganda, further inflaming colonial anger. But the atrocities also reveal something about the British mindset. They view the colonists as subjects in rebellion, not as soldiers in a legitimate army. Rebels don't deserve the honors of war or the protections of military law. This attitude will shape British conduct throughout the coming war, often to their detriment. By the time the column reaches the safety of Charlestown Peninsula, protected by the guns of British warships, the butcher's bill is severe. The British have lost 73 dead, 174 wounded, and 26 missing. The Americans have 49 killed, 39 wounded, and 5 missing. But the casualty numbers don't tell the real story. The real story is that the mighty British Army, the force that defeated the French and conquered half the world, has been bloodied by colonial farmers and shopkeepers. The myth of British invincibility is shattered. Within days, news of Lexington and Concord spreads throughout the 13 colonies. The details become more dramatic with each retelling. The number of British soldiers grows, the heroism of the Minutemen is embellished, but the basic fact remains undeniable. Americans have fought British soldiers and won. The reaction is electric. Militia companies from throughout New England march toward Boston. Within a week, 15,000 colonial soldiers surround the city, trapping the British Army inside. It's the beginning of the Siege of Boston, which will last nearly a year. In Philadelphia, the Second Continental Congress, already scheduled to convene in May, suddenly has a war to manage. The delegates face a stark reality. Fighting has begun. Men have died. There's no going back from this. They have to decide. Do they seek reconciliation with Britain, or do they embrace revolution? Many delegates still hope for peace. They draft the Olive Branch Petition, expressing loyalty to King George III and begging him to intervene against Parliament's oppressive policies. It's a last attempt at compromise, at finding a way to remain within the British Empire while securing colonial rights. But even as they write this petition, they're also taking military action. They establish the Continental Army and appoint George Washington of Virginia as its commander. Washington is an inspired choice. He's a veteran of the French and Indian War with military experience. He's from Virginia, the largest and wealthiest colony, which helps unite the northern and southern colonies, and he has the bearing and character of a leader. When Washington accepts command, he refuses any salary, asking only that his expenses be reimbursed. It's a gesture that establishes his character as a man motivated by duty rather than personal gain. On July 3, 1775, Washington arrives in Cambridge to take command of the army besieging Boston. What he finds is not an army but an armed mob. The 15,000 men surrounding Boston are organized by state and local militias, each with their own officers, their own rules, their own ways of doing things. There's no unified command structure, no standardized training, limited discipline. Many of the soldiers are farmers who expect to go home for harvest. They've elected their own officers, often based on popularity rather than competence. Washington faces the monumental task of turning this collection of militia companies into a real army capable of fighting the British. He needs to establish discipline, create a command structure, obtain supplies, and somehow maintain the siege of Boston without the men simply going home. It's a challenge that would overwhelm most men, but Washington has patience, determination, and an unshakable commitment to the cause. Meanwhile, Britain's response to Lexington and Concord is to send more troops, lots more troops. 3 major generals arrive in Boston in late May: William Howe, Henry Clinton, and John Burgoyne. They're experienced commanders, veterans of European wars. They look at the colonial army surrounding Boston with professional contempt. These aren't soldiers, they're rabble. One good battle will scatter them. The British decide to break the siege by seizing the high ground overlooking Boston. On June 17, they launch an assault on Breed's Hill, adjacent to Bunker Hill, where the Americans have built fortifications overnight. What follows is one of the most famous battles of the war. 2,200 British regulars in perfect formation march up the hill against 1,400 entrenched Americans. The colonial commander, Colonel William Prescott, supposedly gives the famous order, "Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes." Whether he actually said it or not, the tactic is sound. Wait until the enemy is close to maximize the effect of limited ammunition. The British advance in textbook fashion, officers leading, drummers beating the pace, colors flying. They expect the Americans to break and run at the sight of British bayonets. Instead, the Americans wait until the redcoats are within 50 yards, then unleash devastating volleys. The British front ranks are shredded. Officers fall in droves. The assault breaks and retreats down the hill. The British reform and attack again. Again they're met with withering fire. Again they retreat with massive casualties. On the third assault, the Americans finally run out of ammunition. They retreat from the hill, and the British claim victory, but it's a Pyrrhic victory. The British have lost over 1,000 men killed and wounded, nearly half their attacking force. American casualties are about 450. The Battle of Bunker Hill proves something crucial. American soldiers, properly positioned and led, can stand against British regulars. Yes, the British took the hill, but at such cost that they can't afford many more victories like this. General Clinton reportedly says, "A few more such victories would have shortly put an end to British dominion in America." The siege of Boston continues. The two armies stare at each other across fortifications for months. Washington works tirelessly to organize and train his army. Supplies are desperately short. There's not enough gunpowder, not enough weapons, not enough of anything. In November 1775, Washington sends Colonel Henry Knox to Fort Ticonderoga in upstate New York to retrieve captured British cannon. Knox accomplishes an incredible feat of logistics, transporting 60 tons of artillery over 300 miles in the dead of winter, much of it by sled across frozen rivers and through mountain passes. The cannon reached Cambridge in January 1776. Washington places them on Dorchester Heights, overlooking Boston from the south. When the British wake up on March 5th and see American cannon commanding the city, they know their position is untenable. General Howe decides to evacuate. On March 17, 1776, the British Army and over 1,000 Loyalist civilians sail away from Boston, heading to Halifax, Nova Scotia. It's a major American victory, but the war is just beginning. The British will return with much larger forces, determined to crush the rebellion once and for all. The spring of 1776 marks a turning point in the American Revolution. For nearly a year, the Continental Congress has been waging war against Britain while simultaneously protesting their loyalty to King George III. It's an impossible contradiction, and everyone knows it. You can't fight a country's army while claiming to be loyal subjects of that country's king. Something has to give. The delegates in Philadelphia are caught between two incompatible positions. Many still hope for reconciliation. They believe if they can just make the king understand their grievances, if they can just get past his corrupt ministers and parliament, everything can be resolved. They're fighting for their rights as Englishmen, not for independence, but events are pushing them toward a decision they're not ready to make. In August 1775, King George III declared the colonies to be an open rebellion. He rejected the Olive Branch Petition without even reading it. In December, Parliament passed the Prohibitory Act, which declared all American ships and cargoes forfeit to the Crown, essentially treating the colonies as an enemy nation. If Britain is treating them as foreigners, why should they continue claiming to be British subjects? The intellectual groundwork for independence is being laid by a recent immigrant from England named Thomas Paine in January 1776. Paine publishes a pamphlet called Common Sense. It becomes an instant sensation, selling over 100,000 copies in 3 months, an astonishing number in a population of only 2.5 million. Common Sense argues for independence in language that ordinary people can understand. Paine doesn't use legal arguments about constitutional rights. Instead, he makes a simple, powerful case. Monarchy itself is absurd and unjust. Why should anyone have power over others simply because of their birth? Why should Americans, a vast continent, be ruled by a small island thousands of miles away? It makes no sense. He calls King George III a royal brute and tears apart the idea that Britain is a benevolent mother country. What kind of mother devours her children? Paine's pamphlet shifts the debate from rights within the empire to the very legitimacy of the empire itself. People who would never have considered independence before now begin discussing it openly in the Continental Congress. The pressure for independence is building. In April, North Carolina instructs its delegates to vote for independence. Virginia follows in May. One by one, the colonial assemblies are moving toward the inevitable conclusion. On June 7, 1776, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia rises in Congress and introduces a resolution that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is, and ought to be, totally dissolved. The words hang in the air. This is it. This is the moment. Say yes to this resolution, and there's no going back. They'll be rebels and traitors in the eyes of British law. If they lose the war, they'll hang. The debate is fierce. John Dickinson of Pennsylvania argues passionately against independence. It's too soon. They're not ready. They have no allies, no navy, insufficient arms. How can they possibly win against the British Empire? Better to wait, to try negotiation one more time. John Adams argues just as passionately for independence. They're already at war. Men are already dying. They need to make their position clear to the world, especially to potential allies like France and Spain. Those nations won't help rebels trying to reconcile with their king. They'll only help a nation fighting for independence. The debate continues for days. Finally, Congress decides to postpone the vote until July but appoints a committee to draft a declaration explaining their reasons for independence. The committee consists of 5 men: John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, Roger Sherman, and Robert Livingston. They choose Jefferson, a young Virginia lawyer known for his eloquent writing, to draft the document. Jefferson works alone in his rented rooms in Philadelphia, writing by candlelight, crossing out and revising. He's not trying to be original. He's trying to express what he believes most Americans already feel and believe. He draws on ideas that have been circulating in pamphlets and newspapers for months, ideas about natural rights, government by consent, and the right of revolution. The declaration Jefferson produces is a masterpiece of political philosophy and propaganda combined. It begins with universal principles that transcend the specific dispute with Britain. We hold these truths to be self-evident: that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These words will echo through history far beyond the American Revolution. They establish principles that will inspire democratic movements around the world for centuries. Jefferson continues, "Governments derive their powers from the consent of the governed. When a government becomes destructive of the people's rights, the people have the right to alter or abolish it. It's not radical new philosophy." John Locke and other Enlightenment thinkers had made similar arguments, but Jefferson states it with such clarity and eloquence that it becomes the definitive expression of these ideas. After establishing these principles, Jefferson lists specific grievances against King George III. This is crucial. The Declaration needs to justify revolution not just in abstract theory but with concrete evidence of tyranny. Jefferson produces a devastating bill of particulars. The king has refused to approve beneficial laws. He's dissolved representative assemblies. He's obstructed justice. He's kept standing armies in peacetime without colonial consent. He's imposed taxes without representation. He's cut off colonial trade. He's transported large armies of foreign mercenaries to complete the works of death, desolation, and tyranny. The list goes on for 27 specific accusations. Each one is designed to prove that George III is a tyrant who has forfeited any right to colonial allegiance. The committee reviews Jefferson's draft. Franklin and Adams suggests minor changes, most of which Jefferson accepts. The document is submitted to Congress on June 28. On July 1, Congress begins debating both Lee's resolution for independence and Jefferson's declaration. The debate is intense. Every word is scrutinized. Jefferson sits silently, wincing at every proposed change to his carefully crafted prose. Congress makes significant edits. They remove about a quarter of Jefferson's text, including a passage condemning the slave trade. The Southern delegates won't accept criticism of slavery, and the Northern delegates, though many oppose slavery, won't fight over it. Unity is more important than consistency right now. On July 2, Congress votes on Lee's resolution. 12 colonies vote yes. New York abstains, waiting for instructions from home. John Adams writes to his wife Abigail that July 2 will be celebrated as the great anniversary festival, the day America became independent. He's wrong about the date, but right about the celebration. On July 4, Congress approves the final text of Jefferson's declaration. This is the date that will be celebrated, the date on the document. Even though the actual vote for independence happened 2 days earlier, the declaration is sent to the printer. Copies are distributed throughout the colonies. On July 8, it's read publicly for the first time in Philadelphia. Crowds gathered to hear the words, church bells ring, militia fire salutes. In New York, Washington has the declaration read to his troops. A mob pulls down a statue of King George III and melts it down to make musket balls. The symbolism is perfect. The old order is literally being transformed into weapons to defend the new. But even as Americans celebrate, the reality of what they've done begins to sink in. Benjamin Franklin reportedly says, "We must all hang together, or most assuredly we shall all hang separately." He's not joking. What they've done is treason against the British Crown. The penalty for treason is death by hanging. Every man who signed that declaration has put his life, his fortune, and his family at risk. They know this. They sign anyway. The 56 signers of the Declaration of Independence come from all walks of colonial life. There are wealthy plantation owners like Thomas Jefferson and small farmers. There are lawyers like John Adams and merchants like John Hancock. Some are old men, some are young. What unites them is a willingness to risk everything for the principles stated in that document. And they will pay a price. 9 signers will die during the war. 5 will be captured by the British. 12 will have their homes destroyed. 17 will lose their fortunes. But not one will renounce his signature or ask for pardon. Their commitment is absolute. The Declaration of Independence transforms the conflict from a rebellion over taxes and representation into a revolution over fundamental principles of government. It's no longer about specific grievances that might be negotiated. It's about whether people have the right to govern themselves, whether all men are truly created equal, whether governments exist to serve the people or the people exist to serve the government. These are questions that can't be compromised. You either believe in these principles or you don't. By stating them so clearly and publicly, the Declaration makes the American Revolution about ideas that transcend America. It becomes an inspiration for people fighting tyranny everywhere. But declaring independence and actually achieving it are two different things. On paper, the new United States has no chance of winning. Britain has the world's most powerful navy, a professional army of 50,000 men, and the wealth to hire thousands more mercenaries. America has no navy, a poorly trained army of irregular size, and limited manufacturing capacity. Britain has a stable government and unified command. America is 13 separate colonies trying to coordinate through a Congress that has no real authority and no power to tax. Britain has unlimited credit and can borrow whatever it needs to finance the war. America is broke and getting broke up. Any rational analysis says the rebellion will be crushed within a year, but wars aren't won on paper. They're won by soldiers on battlefields and by the will of the people to continue fighting. The Americans have advantages that don't show up in logistics tables. They're fighting on their own territory, which they know intimately. They're fighting for their homes and families, while British soldiers are fighting far from home for a king most have never seen. They're fighting for a cause they believe in, while many British soldiers are just doing their job, and they have one absolutely critical advantage. They don't have to win in any conventional sense, they just have to not lose. They just have to keep fighting until Britain decides the war costs more than it's worth. As summer 1776 continues, the British are preparing a massive campaign to crush the rebellion once and for all. General William Howe, who evacuated Boston in March, is assembling an enormous army in New York. He has 32,000 troops, including 8,000 Hessian mercenaries from Germany. The British fleet carries 450 ships. It's the largest expeditionary force Britain has ever sent overseas. George Washington has about 19,000 men, most of them poorly trained militia. Many have never been in battle. Many lack proper weapons. Some don't even have shoes. On paper, it's no contest. The British will destroy Washington's army and end the rebellion. But Washington isn't thinking about what's on paper. He's thinking about survival, about keeping his army intact, about fighting another day. The struggle for American independence is about to enter its darkest phase, a time when the revolution will come within a hair's breadth of complete failure. August 1776, New York City is about to become a killing ground. General William Howe's massive British and Hessian force has landed on Staten Island, and Washington knows an attack is coming. The question is where? New York is a nightmare to defend. It's surrounded by water with rivers and harbors that British ships can easily navigate. Washington has to defend multiple islands with an inferior force against an enemy that controls the sea. It's a strategic impossibility, but Congress has ordered him to hold New York. To abandon it without a fight would be devastating to American morale. So Washington spreads his army thin across Manhattan, Long Island, and the surrounding areas, knowing that wherever Howe attacks, the Americans will be outnumbered and outmaneuvered. On August 22nd, Howe makes his move. 15,000 British and Hessian troops land on Long Island, near the western end. Washington has about 9,000 men defending Brooklyn Heights, a strategic position overlooking the East River and Manhattan. The American commander on Long Island, General Israel Putnam, has fortified the heights but left only a small force to guard the passes through the wooded hills to the south. It's a fatal mistake. Howe sends a powerful flanking column on a night march through Jamaica Pass, which the Americans have left virtually unguarded. On the morning of August 27th, the Battle of Long Island begins. The British attack from multiple directions. The American units in front of Brooklyn Heights are caught between British forces and destroyed or captured. It's a complete disaster. The Americans retreat in chaos to their fortifications on Brooklyn Heights. Washington, who has crossed over from Manhattan when the fighting started, watches helplessly as his army is shattered. The British have demonstrated their overwhelming superiority in conventional warfare. American casualties are over 300 killed and wounded, and over 1,000 captured, including 3 generals. British losses are less than 400 total. Howe has Washington's army trapped with their backs to the East River. British ships can move up the river and cut off any retreat. One more push and the entire American army will be destroyed or captured. The revolution could end right here, right now. But Howe doesn't push. He decides to besiege the American position rather than assault it. It's the first of many times that British caution will save Washington's army from annihilation. On the night of August 29th, Washington executes one of the most brilliant maneuvers of the war. Using every boat he can find, he evacuates his entire army across the East River to Manhattan under cover of darkness. 9,000 men, their weapons, their supplies, all moved across a mile of water in a single night. British sentries are close enough to hear voices, but a providential fog rolls in at dawn, concealing the final stages of the retreat. By the time Howe realizes what's happened, the Americans are gone. It's an incredible feat, but it's still a retreat. Washington has lost a major battle and abandoned Long Island. The Continental Army's confidence is shaken. Desertions begin. Militiamen whose enlistments are up simply go home. Washington briefly considers defending Manhattan, but he knows it's hopeless. The island is surrounded by British-controlled water. The enemy can land anywhere they choose. On September 15th, British forces land at Kip's Bay on the east side of Manhattan. The Connecticut militia defending the landing site panic and run without firing more than a few shots. Washington arrives as his men are fleeing. He's so enraged that he throws his hat on the ground and reportedly shouts that he wishes to God the British would shoot him. He has to be physically pulled away as enemy troops advance. Only a determined standby units under Colonel Thomas Knowlton prevents total disaster. The British capture New York City, which they will hold for the rest of the war. Washington retreats north to Harlem Heights, then to White Plains, fighting small delaying actions. At White Plains on October 28th, the armies clash again. It's another British victory, though not as decisive as Long Island. Washington retreats further north into Westchester. He's facing a terrible decision. Fort Washington, on the northern tip of Manhattan, still holds out with a garrison of nearly 3,000 men. Should he evacuate it or try to hold it? Fort Washington commands the Hudson River. If it falls, the British will have complete control of the waterway. But it's also vulnerable, surrounded by British forces. General Nathanael Greene, one of Washington's most trusted officers, argues for holding the fort. Washington reluctantly agrees. It's a catastrophic mistake. On November 16th, Howe attacks Fort Washington with overwhelming force. The garrison is surrounded and has no line of retreat. After fierce fighting, the fort's commander, Colonel Robert Margot, surrenders. The British capture nearly 3,000 American prisoners, along with massive quantities of arms and supplies. Washington watches from across the Hudson River, helpless to intervene. It's his worst defeat of the war. 3 days later, Fort Lee on the New Jersey side of the Hudson also falls. Though most of the garrison escapes, Washington's army is disintegrating. From over 20,000 men in August, he's down to fewer than 5,000. Many men's enlistments will expire on December 31st, just 6 weeks away. The British seem unstoppable. General Charles Cornwallis pursues Washington across New Jersey with about 10,000 men. Town after town falls to the advancing Redcoats and Hessians. New Jersey loyalists, emboldened by British success, take up arms against their rebel neighbors. The state seems lost. Washington retreats constantly, always staying just ahead of Cornwallis, never allowing his army to be cornered and destroyed. On November 21st, the Americans cross the Raritan River at New Brunswick, destroying the bridge behind them. Cornwallis pauses for supplies, giving Washington a few days' head start. The Continental Army staggers south across New Jersey like a wounded animal, leaving behind stragglers, deserters, and men too sick to continue. By early December, Washington crosses the Delaware River into Pennsylvania, bringing every boat for miles up and down the river with him. Cornwallis reaches the Delaware on December 8th but can't cross. Without boats, his pursuit is halted. He establishes a string of outposts along the New Jersey side of the river and goes into winter quarters. The fighting season, by European standards, is over. Armies don't campaign in winter. Cornwallis heads to New York, leaving Hessian Colonel Johann Rowell with 1,400 troops in Trenton. General Howe settles into comfortable quarters in New York City. They've crushed the rebel army. When spring comes, they'll finish the job. The rebellion is all but over. The situation is desperate beyond measure. Washington's army is down to fewer than 3,000 men fit for duty. In 2 weeks, most of their enlistments expire. Congress has fled Philadelphia for Baltimore, fearing British capture. The public is losing faith. Recruits aren't coming forward. Some prominent rebels are talking about negotiating terms of surrender. Thomas Paine, who marched with the army through the retreat, writes another pamphlet called The American Crisis. It begins with words that will be read to the shivering soldiers. These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of their country, but he that stands by it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman. Washington knows he needs a victory, any victory, or the revolution will collapse. He also knows he's running out of time. In 2 weeks, his army will cease to exist. He studies his maps and his intelligence reports. The British are scattered across New Jersey in various outposts. They're comfortable, confident, not expecting an attack in winter. The Hessians at Trenton are supposedly celebrating Christmas with plenty of food and alcohol. They're professional soldiers, but they're overconfident and careless. If Washington can surprise them, if he can win even a small victory, it might save the cause. It's a desperate gamble. If he fails, if the British destroy his army, the revolution is finished. But if he does nothing, the revolution is finished anyway. He has to attack. Washington plans a complex operation. His army will cross the icy Delaware River on Christmas night and attack Trenton at dawn. 3 separate crossings will surround the town and cut off retreat. The plan requires perfect timing and coordination from an exhausted, demoralized army in the middle of winter. The odds of success are slim, but Washington has no choice. It's act or die. Christmas Day 1776 is brutally cold. A northeaster brings freezing rain and sleet. The Delaware River is choked with ice floes. The weather is so terrible that 2 of the 3 planned crossings have to be cancelled. Only Washington's main force of 2,400 men makes it across, and even that takes 9 hours. They don't start marching toward Trenton until 3 in the morning, hours behind schedule. The soldiers march through the storm wearing whatever clothes they have. Many have no coats. Some have no shoes and leave bloody footprints in the snow. The 9-mile march to Trenton takes hours. By the time they arrive, it's after 8 in the morning, well past dawn. The surprise Washington hoped for seems impossible, but, incredibly, the Hessians are completely unprepared. The sentries are sheltering from the weather. The officers are hungover from Christmas celebrations. When the Americans suddenly appear and begin firing, the Hessians are caught completely off guard. Colonel Rowell tries to rally his men, but it's too late. American artillery commanded by young Captain Alexander Hamilton sweeps the streets. The Hessians attempt to form up but are surrounded. After less than an hour of fighting, it's over. Rowell is mortally wounded. The Hessians surrender. Washington has captured over 900 prisoners, killed or wounded more than 100, and suffered only 5 American casualties, none of them fatal. It's a complete, stunning victory. Washington wanted a victory to boost morale. He's gotten more than he dared hope for. The prisoners are marched back across the Delaware, a visible sign that the Continental Army still exists and can fight. News of Trenton spreads rapidly. It's not a major battle by military standards, but psychologically it's enormous. The invincible British and Hessians can be beaten. The revolution isn't over, but Washington isn't done. He knows one victory isn't enough. He needs to keep the pressure on, to keep the British off balance. On December 30th, he learns that most of his men's enlistments expire the next day. He rides along the lines and speaks to them. He needs them to stay for just 6 more weeks. He offers a $10 bonus to anyone who will extend. At first, no one steps forward. Then a few men do, then more. It's enough. Washington recrosses the Delaware with his reinforced army and reoccupies Trenton. Cornwallis, humiliated by the defeat, rushes south from New York with 8,000 men. He's determined to crush Washington once and for all. On January 2, 1777, Cornwallis reaches Trenton. The two armies skirmish, and Washington retreats to a strong position south of town with his back to a Pink Creek. Cornwallis decides to wait until morning to attack. He's confident that Washington is trapped, that tomorrow he'll destroy the rebel army. He reportedly tells his officers, "We've got the old fox now. We'll bag him in the morning." But Washington has other plans. Leaving a few men to keep the campfires burning and make noise, he marches his army around Cornwallis's flank during the night. It's another incredible night march, conducted in near silence on frozen roads. By dawn, Washington's army is behind British lines, marching toward Princeton. At Princeton, the Americans encounter British reinforcements heading to join Cornwallis. A sharp fight develops. At first, the Americans start to break, but Washington personally leads a charge that stabilizes the line. The British are routed. Washington has won another victory. Cornwallis, discovering that Washington has escaped the trap, rushes his army back toward Princeton, but Washington is already moving. Rather than risk a battle against superior forces, he marches his army to Morristown in the hills of northern New Jersey, where he establishes winter quarters in a strong defensive position. In 10 days, Washington has transformed the war. 2 victories and a brilliant strategic withdrawal have restored American morale and British respect for the Continental Army. The Revolution has survived its darkest hour. The winter of 1777 brings a deceptive calm. Washington's army sits in the hills around Morristown, New Jersey, slowly rebuilding its strength. The British occupy New York City and control much of New Jersey. Neither side can deliver a knockout blow, but in London, British strategists are planning what they believe will be the decisive campaign of the war. The plan is elegant in its simplicity. A 3-pronged attack will cut off New England, the heart of the rebellion, from the rest of the colonies. General John Burgoyne will lead a large army south from Canada along Lake Champlain and the Hudson River. Lieutenant Colonel Barry St. Leger will lead a smaller force east from Lake Ontario through the Mohawk Valley. General Howe will march north from New York City up the Hudson. The 3 armies will meet at Albany, severing New England from the middle and southern colonies. It's called the Saratoga Campaign, and on paper, it should work. The British will split the colonies in 2, isolate New England where most of the rebellion's support lies, and systematically crush the separated rebel forces. There's just one problem. The plan requires precise coordination between 3 armies operating over hundreds of miles of wilderness, connected only by slow communications. It requires how to prioritize the Hudson River campaign over other objectives. It requires Burgoyne to move through difficult terrain against an enemy that knows every inch of it. It requires everything to go right. And in war, nothing ever goes completely right. Gentleman Johnny Burgoyne, as he's known, is confident as he begins his march south from Canada in June 1777. He has about 8,000 men, including British regulars, Hessian mercenaries, Canadian militia, and Native American allies. He's got plenty of artillery and supplies. He's a competent commander with experience in European warfare. He expects to march through the sparsely populated wilderness, brush aside whatever rebel militia oppose him, and reach Albany in a few weeks. The campaign starts well. On July 5th, Burgoyne captures Fort Ticonderoga, the fortress that had been considered the key to the Hudson Valley. The Americans abandon it without a major fight. The news causes panic in Congress and celebrations in London. King George III supposedly exclaims, "I have beat them. I have beat all the Americans." But taking Fort Ticonderoga is the easy part. Now Burgoyne has to march through dense forest and swampland with a massive supply train. The Americans may have abandoned the fort, but they're not beaten. They're employing a strategy that will become a pattern in this war. General Philip Schuyler, commanding the American Northern Department, orders a scorched earth policy. As Burgoyne advances, the Americans destroy bridges, cut down trees to block roads, divert streams to flood paths, and drive away livestock. Every mile Burgoyne marches becomes harder than the last. His supply lines stretch longer. His men grow exhausted cutting through obstacles, and all around him, invisible in the forests, American militia are gathering. By mid-August, Burgoyne has only reached the upper Hudson, still about 60 miles from Albany. He's running low on supplies, particularly horses to move his artillery and supply wagons. He learns that the Americans have a supply depot at Bennington, Vermont, with horses, food, and ammunition. He sends a detachment of about 800 men, mostly Hessians and Loyalists, to seize it. It's a fatal mistake. On August 16th, at the Battle of Bennington, American militia under General John Stark ambushes and destroys Burgoyne's detachment. Over 200 are killed and another 700 captured. Burgoyne has lost more than 10% of his army and gained nothing. Even worse, the American victory energizes the militia. Thousands of New England farmers grab their muskets and join the army opposing Burgoyne. Meanwhile, St. Leger's column advancing through the Mohawk Valley has run into its own disaster. At Fort Stanwix, American defenders hold out against St. Leger's siege. At the Battle of Oriskany on August 6th, Mohawk Valley militia fight a brutal engagement against St. Leger's force. Though technically a British victory, it's so costly that St. Leger's advance is halted. Then Benedict Arnold, one of Washington's most aggressive commanders, leads a relief force toward Fort Stanwix. Arnold employs a clever ruse, sending a loyalist prisoner into St. Leger's camp with exaggerated reports of a huge American army approaching St. Leger's Native American allies. Already demoralized by heavy losses at a risk, he abandoned him. Without them, St. Leger retreats back to Canada. The second prong of the British plan has failed completely. That leaves Burgoyne alone, deep in American territory, with a growing enemy army in front of him and no support coming from the west. Where is General Howe? Why isn't he marching north to meet Burgoyne? The answer is simple and devastating. Howe has decided to do something else entirely. Instead of supporting Burgoyne, Howe has taken his army to attack Philadelphia. Howe's reasoning seems sound to him. Philadelphia is the rebel capital. Capturing it will be a psychological blow to the Americans. He can defeat Washington's army, which is sure to defend the city. Then, with the main rebel army destroyed and the capital captured, he can march north and link up with Burgoyne at his leisure. But this decision dooms the Saratoga Campaign. Burgoyne is on his own. By early September, Burgoyne reaches Saratoga, about 30 miles north of Albany. The American army, now commanded by General Horatio Gates after Schuyler was replaced, has taken up a strong position on Bemis Heights, blocking the road to Albany. The Americans have about 7,000 men entrenched on high ground. Burgoyne has about 6,000, exhausted from their march and running low on supplies. On September 19th, Burgoyne attacks in what becomes known as the Battle of Freeman's Farm. The fighting is fierce and confused in the wooded terrain. Benedict Arnold, commanding the American left wing, conducts a brilliant tactical battle. The British take heavy casualties but technically hold the field at day's end. But it's a Pyrrhic victory. Burgoyne has lost about 600 men he can't replace. The Americans, with militia reinforcing them daily, can absorb their 400 casualties. Burgoyne is now trapped. He can't advance past the American position. He can't retreat because the Americans control his supply lines. He can only wait and hope that help arrives from New York. For 3 weeks, the two armies face each other. Every day, Burgoyne's position grows more desperate. Food is running short. Ammunition is limited. Desertion is increasing. On October 7th, Burgoyne makes a reconnaissance in force to probe the American defenses. It develops into the Second Battle of Saratoga, also called the Battle of Bemis Heights. Arnold, who has quarreled with Gates and been relieved of command, can't stay out of the fight. Without orders, he rushes into battle and leads devastating attacks against the British positions. He's wounded in the leg, but not before his leadership turns the battle into an American victory. The British are driven back with heavy losses. Their position is now hopeless. Burgoyne tries to retreat north during the night but finds his path blocked by American forces. He's completely surrounded. On October 17, 1777, Burgoyne surrenders his entire army, nearly 6,000 men, to General Gates. It's the most significant American victory of the war to this point. An entire British army has been captured. The British strategy to split the colonies has failed utterly. American morale soars, but the real importance of Saratoga isn't what it means to Americans. It's what it means to the rest of the world, particularly France. France has been watching the American Revolution with great interest. The French lost their North American empire to Britain in the French and Indian War. They're eager for revenge and happy to see Britain struggling with colonial rebellion. But France isn't going to openly support what looks like a losing cause. They've been providing covert aid to the Americans since 1776, secret shipments of weapons and supplies, but nothing official. They need to see that the Americans can actually win before they risk war with Britain. Saratoga provides that proof. When news reaches Paris in December 1777, the French government moves quickly. American diplomats led by Benjamin Franklin have been in Paris since 1776, trying to secure an alliance. Franklin is already a celebrity in France, famous for his scientific experiments with electricity and his writings. He's become the face of American liberty, celebrated in French salons, his portrait on everything from snuff boxes to chamber pots. Now, with Saratoga demonstrating American military viability, France is ready to commit. In February 1778, France and the United States signed 2 treaties. The Treaty of Amity and Commerce establishes trade relations. More importantly, the Treaty of Alliance creates a military partnership. France recognizes American independence and commits to fight alongside America until independence is secured. The French alliance transforms the war. Britain is no longer fighting a colonial rebellion. It's now fighting a global war against its traditional enemy. The Royal Navy, which has dominated American waters, must now defend against the French fleet. British troops stationed in America might be needed in the Caribbean to defend Sugar Islands. British strategy must account for possible French attacks on British territories worldwide. The colonists are no longer alone. They have a powerful ally with a professional army and navy. Spain will join the war in 1779, and the Netherlands in 1780. Britain will face enemies on multiple fronts. For Americans, the French alliance means everything. French money will help finance the war. French weapons and supplies will equip the Continental Army. French military advisors will help train American troops. And most crucially, the French Navy will challenge British control of the seas. Naval power has been Britain's decisive advantage throughout the war. French ships can contest that advantage, potentially trapping British armies in coastal positions. But the alliance also creates complications. France isn't fighting for American ideals or liberty. France is fighting to weaken Britain and restore French power. The war becomes entangled with European power politics. American and French war aims don't always align. There will be tensions and disagreements throughout the alliance. For now though, Americans celebrate the impossible is starting to look possible. Meanwhile, Washington and his army are enduring their own trial while Burgoyne faces disaster at Saratoga. In September 1777, Howe defeats Washington at the Battle of Brandywine and captures Philadelphia. Congress flees to York, Pennsylvania. Washington attacks the main British camp at Germantown in October, but is defeated after initial success. These defeats are frustrating, but they're not catastrophic. Washington's army survives and remains a threat. The British occupy Philadelphia but control little beyond the city itself. In December, Washington takes his army into winter quarters at Valley Forge, about 20 miles from Philadelphia. Valley Forge will become legendary in American memory as a symbol of suffering and perseverance. The Continental Army endures a brutal winter with inadequate food, shelter, and clothing. Soldiers live in crude log huts. Many lack shoes or blankets. Disease is rampant. About 2,000 men die from illness and exposure. The suffering is real and terrible. But Valley Forge is also where the Continental Army becomes a truly professional force. A Prussian officer named Baron Friedrich von Steuben arrives in February 1778 and begins drilling the troops. Steuben is a military professional who has served in the Prussian army, one of the finest in Europe. He doesn't speak English well, so he demonstrates maneuvers himself and uses interpreters. He writes a training manual adapted to American conditions. He works with officers and sergeants to create a standardized system of drill and discipline. By the time the army marches out of Valley Forge in June 1778, it's a transformed force. The soldiers can maneuver on the battlefield, can execute complex formations, can stand and fight against British regulars on equal terms. The contrast with the disorganized militia of 1775 is striking. This is now a real army, disciplined and trained, capable of matching European professionals. As spring arrives and news of the French alliance reaches America, the mood transforms. The army that suffered through Valley Forge emerges lean, hard, and ready to fight. The British, recognizing that the war has changed with French entry, evacuate Philadelphia and consolidate their forces in New York. On June 28, Washington attacks the British rearguard at Monmouth Courthouse in New Jersey. The battle is confused and nearly becomes an American defeat when General Charles Lee orders a retreat. Washington arrives, relieves Lee of command, and personally rallies the troops. The Battle of Monmouth ends in a draw, but the Continental Army has proved it can fight the British in open battle. The war has reached a turning point. The Americans have survived their darkest hours, gained a powerful ally, and forged an army capable of winning independence. After the Battle of Monmouth in June 1778, the war in the North settles into a frustrating stalemate. Washington's army and the British forces in New York watch each other across fortified lines. Neither side can deliver a decisive blow. The British hold New York City and some surrounding territory. The Americans control most of the countryside. Small raids and skirmishes occur, but no major battles. For the average soldier, it's a war of boredom punctuated by occasional terror. For commanders on both sides, it's a strategic puzzle with no obvious solution. The British can't destroy Washington's army, which refuses to fight unless circumstances favor it. Washington can't dislodge the British from New York without a powerful navy to support an attack. The arrival of French naval forces changes the equation, but not decisively. In August 1778, a combined American and French operation attempts to capture the British garrison at Newport, Rhode Island. The plan falls apart due to bad weather, poor coordination between allies, and British reinforcements. The French fleet withdraws, and the American land forces retreat after a sharp battle. It's a disappointing debut for the Franco-American alliance. Both sides learn that coordinating operations between different nations with different languages, tactics, and objectives is harder than it seems. The failure at Newport reveals tensions in the alliance. Some Americans resent needing French help. Some French officers look down on the Americans as undisciplined amateurs. But both sides learn to work together better over time. The stalemate in the North forces the British to reconsider their strategy. They've been fighting this war as a rebellion to be suppressed. Send armies to crush the rebels, occupy their cities, restore royal authority. But it's not working. 3 years of fighting have failed to end the rebellion. The Americans won't stand and fight when overmatched. They retreat, regroup, and return. Occupying cities means nothing when the countryside remains hostile. Every British outpost needs guards, every supply convoy needs escorts. There aren't enough troops to occupy and pacify all 13 colonies. Sir Henry Clinton, who replaced Howe as commander in 1778, develops a new strategy: focus on the South. British intelligence suggests the southern colonies have more loyalists than New England or the middle colonies. Loyalist support could be mobilized to pacify large areas with fewer British troops. The southern economy based on plantation agriculture is more vulnerable to disruption than northern commerce and manufacturing. Control the South, use loyalist militia to hold territory, then move north and roll up the rebellion colony by colony. In late 1778, Clinton sends an expedition to Georgia under Lieutenant Colonel Archibald Campbell. On December 29th, Campbell captures Savannah with minimal resistance. Within weeks, British forces controlled most of Georgia. Loyalist militia emerged to support them. It seems to validate the Southern strategy. Americans attempt to retake Savannah in September 1779 with help from a French fleet and 4,000 French troops. The siege of Savannah ends in disaster when a poorly coordinated assault on October 9th results in heavy casualties. The French fleet withdraws. Georgia remains in British hands. Emboldened by success in Georgia, Clinton personally leads a massive expedition against Charleston, South Carolina, in early 1780. Charleston is the South's largest city and busiest port. Its capture would be a devastating blow. Clinton lands his army south of Charleston in February and begins siege operations. General Benjamin Lincoln commands about 5,000 American troops defending the city. He should retreat before he's trapped, but South Carolina political leaders insist he defend Charleston. It's a fatal decision. By April, Clinton has the city surrounded by land and sea. On May 12, 1780, Lincoln surrenders. The British capture the entire American Southern Army, over 5,000 men. It's the worst American defeat of the entire war. The loss is catastrophic. The South now has no organized American army. British forces and loyalist militia spread out across South Carolina, occupying key points and attempting to pacify the countryside. Clinton returns to New York, leaving Cornwallis with about 8,000 men to complete the conquest of the South. For a while it looks like the Southern strategy is working. Loyalists come forward in significant numbers. British forces move through South Carolina with minimal opposition. But the British are making a crucial mistake. They're trying to fight this war by European rules in a place where those rules don't apply. In Europe, when you capture an enemy army and occupy territory, the war in that area is over. The defeated side acknowledges loss and accepts occupation. But in South Carolina, capturing the army doesn't end the resistance, it transforms it. Without a formal army to enlist in, men who oppose British rule form irregular units. They become partisans, guerrilla fighters who strike from the swamps and forests, ambush supply convoys, attack isolated outposts, and disappear before British regulars can respond. Leaders like Francis Marion, Thomas Sumter, and Andrew Pickens create partisan bands that make British occupation a nightmare. Marion, known as the Swamp Fox, operates from hideouts in the Carolina swamps, appearing suddenly to attack and then vanishing. These aren't conventional soldiers. They're farmers and hunters who know every trail and creek. They strike and fade, never giving the British a chance to bring superior force to bear. The British respond with harsh measures. Cornwallis authorizes his officers to treat partisan fighters as outlaws rather than soldiers. Captured partisans are often hanged rather than treated as prisoners of war. Loyalist militia, given free rein to suppress rebels, engage in brutal reprisals. Farms are burned, property seized, families terrorized. The violence spirals. What might have been a political conflict over governance becomes a vicious civil war. Neighbors who chose different sides murder each other. Families are torn apart. The violence in the Carolina backcountry reaches levels of cruelty rarely seen in the northern campaigns. At the Battle of Waxhaws on May 29, 1780, British cavalry under Colonel Banastre Tarleton massacres surrendering American troops. The phrase "Tarleton's quarter," meaning no quarter given, becomes a rallying cry for American partisans. Far from pacifying South Carolina, British harshness drives more people into rebellion. Congress sends General Horatio Gates, the hero of Saratoga, to take command in the South. Gates has a reputation as a competent, cautious commander, but at the Battle of Camden on August 16, 1780, Gates makes disastrous tactical errors. He deploys inexperienced militia on his front line against veteran British regulars. The militia breaks at the first British charge. The entire American army collapses. Gates flees the battlefield and reportedly doesn't stop riding until he's 180 miles away. It's a humiliating defeat that destroys his reputation. American casualties are over 1,000 killed, wounded, or captured. British losses are less than 300. The South seems lost. After Camden, Cornwallis invades North Carolina, confident he can replicate his success in South Carolina. But his advance stalls when American frontier militia destroy a loyalist force of over 1,000 men at the Battle of Kings Mountain on October 7, 1780. The Loyalists are surrounded on a hilltop and cut to pieces. It's a shocking reversal that demonstrates the limits of relying on loyalist militia. They can win when fighting other militia, but they're not capable of sustained operations against determined opposition. Kings Mountain forces Cornwallis to retreat back to South Carolina for the winter. Meanwhile, Washington makes one of his best decisions of the war. He sends Nathanael Greene to take command in the South. Greene is Washington's most trusted subordinate, a Rhode Islander who has proved himself a master of logistics and strategy. Greene arrives in December 1780 and finds an army of about 2,000 men, poorly equipped and demoralized after repeated defeats. Greene immediately grasps the situation. He can't defeat Cornwallis in a conventional battle. The British are too strong, but he doesn't need to win battles. He needs to wear the British down, keep them moving, force them to expend resources, and prevent them from pacifying territory. Greene divides his small army, sending Daniel Morgan with about 600 men to operate in western South Carolina, while he takes the rest to the east. It's a risky move that violates conventional military wisdom. Never divide your force in the face of a superior enemy, but Greene understands this isn't a conventional war. Cornwallis responds by dividing his own army to pursue both American forces. He sends Tarleton with over 1,000 men after Morgan. On January 17, 1781, at Cowpens in northern South Carolina, Morgan fights a masterful tactical battle. He uses the terrain brilliantly, positions his troops in successive lines that absorb and redirect British attacks, and surrounds Tarleton's force. It's a complete American victory. British casualties are over 300. American losses are minimal. Over 500 British soldiers are captured. Tarleton barely escapes with his cavalry. Cowpens is exactly the kind of victory the Americans needed. It proves they can defeat British regulars in open battle with proper tactics and leadership. Cornwallis is furious and determined to catch and destroy Morgan's force before it can link up with Greene. What follows is one of the most remarkable campaigns of the war, the Race to the Don. Greene orders Morgan to retreat north. Cornwallis pursues, determined to bring the Americans to battle before they cross the Don River into Virginia. Cornwallis destroys his supply wagons to move faster. His army travels light, living off the land, marching rapidly through winter weather. Greene conducts a brilliant fighting retreat, always staying just ahead of Cornwallis, never allowing himself to be trapped. His army crosses the Don River into Virginia on February 14th. Cornwallis reaches the river too late. The Americans are safe. Cornwallis has chased Greene across North Carolina and gained nothing. His army is exhausted and short of supplies. He retreats back into North Carolina to rest and refit. Greene, reinforced with militia, recrosses the Dan and begins shadowing the British. On March 15, 1781, Greene decides to fight at Guilford Courthouse. He has over 4,000 men, though mostly militia, against Cornwallis's 2,000 battle-hardened regulars. Greene borrows Morgan's tactics from Cowpens, positioning his militia in front with orders to fire 2 volleys and then retreat, letting the regulars behind them carry the battle. The battle is fierce. The militia perform better than expected. The fighting comes down to close-quarters combat. Cornwallis makes a controversial decision. To break the American line, he orders his artillery to fire grape shot into the melee, killing his own men along with the Americans. It works. The American line breaks, and Greene retreats. Cornwallis holds the field, so technically it's a British victory, but the cost is devastating. British casualties are over 500, nearly a quarter of his army. American losses are heavier in absolute numbers, but Greene can replace them. Cornwallis can't. A British politician, Charles James Fox, will later say of this battle that another such victory would ruin the British army. Cornwallis retreats to Wilmington on the coast to recover. He's won the battle but lost the campaign. He can't pacify North Carolina with his depleted force. Greene makes a brilliant strategic decision. Instead of following Cornwallis, he marches his army back into South Carolina. He's going to liberate the state from British control while Cornwallis recovers. From April through June 1781, Greene fights a series of battles against British outposts throughout South Carolina. At Hobcook's Hill on April 25th, at 96 in May and June, at Utah Springs on September 8th. Greene loses most of these battles tactically but wins the campaign strategically. Each battle weakens the British. Each battle forces them to abandon outlying posts and concentrate in Charleston. By autumn, the British control only Charleston and a few coastal areas. The rest of South Carolina and Georgia is back in American hands. Greene has accomplished what seemed impossible. He's defeated the British Southern strategy not by winning battles but by refusing to lose the war. While Greene is liberating the South, Cornwallis makes a fateful decision. Rather than staying in the Carolinas, he marches his army north into Virginia. He believes he can achieve more there, disrupting Virginia's supplies and drawing Greene after him. It's a strategic error that will lead to the climactic battle of the war. Summer 1781. The war has been raging for 6 years. Both sides are exhausted. The British have poured enormous resources into suppressing the rebellion and have little to show for it. They hold New York, Charleston, and Savannah, but control of the countryside remains contested. The Continental Army is still in the field, still fighting. The American economy is in shambles, the currency nearly worthless, but the will to resist remains unbroken. Neither side can deliver a knockout blow. Then, in a remarkable convergence of circumstances, opportunity presents itself. Lord Cornwallis marches into Virginia in May 1781 with about 7,000 troops. He's come north from the Carolinas, abandoning the campaign there to strike at what he sees as the source of supplies and reinforcements for the Southern rebels. Virginia is the largest and wealthiest state, and if Cornwallis can subdue it, perhaps the rebellion will finally collapse. He raids across Virginia throughout May and June, destroying supply depots and chasing a small American force under the young Marquis de Lafayette. Lafayette, a young French nobleman who volunteered to serve in the Continental Army, has only about 3,000 men. He's badly outnumbered and conducts a fighting retreat, avoiding battle but harassing Cornwallis's flanks and rear. Cornwallis receives orders from Sir Henry Clinton in New York to establish a fortified deep-water port where the Royal Navy can support him and evacuate his troops if necessary. After some deliberation, Cornwallis chooses Yorktown, a small tobacco port on the York River near Chesapeake Bay. He begins fortifying the position in early August. In New York, Washington is planning an attack on the British garrison there. His army of about 5,000 Continentals is camped outside the city. A French army of equal size under Count Rochambeau is nearby. Together, they might be able to assault New York, but it's heavily fortified and Clinton has over 10,000 troops. Washington knows an attack would be costly and might fail. Then, in mid-August, Washington receives electrifying news. Admiral François de Grasse, commanding a powerful French fleet, is sailing north from the Caribbean with over 3,000 French troops aboard. But de Grasse isn't heading to New York. He's heading to Chesapeake Bay, and he can only stay until mid-October before he must return to the Caribbean. Washington grasps the opportunity immediately. If de Grasse controls Chesapeake Bay, Cornwallis's army at Yorktown will be cut off from naval support and reinforcement. If Washington and Rochambeau can move their armies south quickly enough, they can trap Cornwallis between their forces and the French fleet. It's an enormous risk. Washington will be marching his army away from New York, leaving American territory exposed to British attack. He'll be depending on the French fleet to arrive on time and stay long enough. Everything has to work perfectly. But if it does work, the Americans might capture an entire British army. Washington makes the decision. The combined Franco-American army begins moving south on August 19th. Washington conducts an elaborate deception to make Clinton think he's still planning to attack New York. He has his army build baking ovens in New Jersey as if preparing for a long siege. He spreads false intelligence. Clinton is fooled. By the time he realizes Washington is marching south, it's too late to catch him. The march itself is a logistical marvel. Over 7,000 troops, thousands of support personnel, hundreds of wagons, artillery pieces, all have to move 450 miles in less than a month. They march through New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Maryland. In Philadelphia, they parade through the streets to wild cheering. Congress comes out to watch. It's a morale boost for civilians who've seen mostly defeats and retreats. The army continues south, some units marching, others transported by ship down Chesapeake Bay. On September 5th, the French fleet arrives at Chesapeake Bay, but so does a British fleet under Admiral Thomas Graves, sent from New York to support Cornwallis. The two fleets clash in the Battle of the Chesapeake, one of the most important naval battles in history. It's not particularly dramatic. The two lines of warships exchange broadsides for about 2.5 hours. Casualties and damage are moderate on both sides. But when the smoke clears, Graves decides his fleet is too damaged to continue the fight. He withdraws and sails back to New York. De Grasse's fleet controls Chesapeake Bay. Cornwallis is now cut off by sea. A few days later, another French naval squadron arrives from Rhode Island, bringing more supplies and siege artillery. The trap is set. By late September, the entire Franco-American army has reached Yorktown. Washington has about 9,000 American troops. Rochambeau has over 7,000 French regulars. Cornwallis has about 8,000 British and Hessian soldiers fortified in Yorktown and across the river at Gloucester Point. He's outnumbered roughly 2-1, but he's in a fortified position with his back to the water. If the Royal Navy can break de Grasse's blockade, Cornwallis can be reinforced or evacuated. Clinton in New York promises to send a relief expedition. Cornwallis decides to hold out and wait for help. The siege begins on September 28th. The Allied forces surround Yorktown and start digging approach trenches. The standard method of siege warfare. Engineers design parallel trenches that move closer to the enemy fortifications. Artillery bombards the defenses. Sappers dig forward under covering fire. It's methodical, professional work. The French troops are experienced in European siege warfare. The Continental Army has learned a lot in 6 years of war. They work together effectively. Cornwallis tries to disrupt the siege operations with artillery fire and occasional sorties, but he's too outnumbered. The Allied artillery pounds his positions relentlessly. On October 9th, the first major bombardment begins. Over 50 siege guns and mortar open fire on the British defenses. The town of Yorktown is systematically destroyed. Buildings collapse. Fortifications crumble. British casualties mount. Cornwallis writes to Clinton that he can't hold out much longer without relief. By October 14th, the Allied forces have moved their siege lines close enough to assault the British outer defenses to key British redoubts. Fortified positions must be taken before the siege can advance further. Washington orders simultaneous assaults on both redoubts. The American assault on Redoubt 10 is led by Alexander Hamilton, who has been pleading for a field command. His men attack with unloaded muskets, relying on bayonets. It's a bold, aggressive assault. They overwhelm the defenders in less than 10 minutes with minimal casualties. Meanwhile, French troops attack Redoubt 9 and capture it after tougher fighting. The British defensive perimeter is now untenable. On October 16th, Cornwallis makes a desperate attempt to evacuate his army across the York River to Gloucester Point. From there, he might break through the smaller Allied force and escape overland, but a sudden storm scatters his boats. The evacuation fails. Cornwallis is trapped. On the morning of October 17th, a British drummer appears on the parapet, beating the call for parley. The firing stops. A British officer comes forward with a white flag. Cornwallis wants to discuss terms of surrender. Negotiations take 2 days. Cornwallis hopes for honors of war, allowing his troops to march out with flags flying and muskets shouldered. Washington, remembering how the British refused such honors to American troops at Charleston, denies them. On October 19, 1781, the British Army marches out of Yorktown to surrender. 8,000 British and Hessian troops lay down their arms. They march between lines of French and American soldiers. Supposedly, the British military bands play a tune called "The World Turned Upside Down." Though this detail may be legend, Cornwallis himself refuses to attend the ceremony, claiming illness. His second-in-command, General Charles Aura, offers the sword of surrender to Rochambeau, trying to surrender to the French rather than the Americans. Rochambeau directs him to Washington. Washington, in turn, directs O'Hara to surrender to his second-in-command, General Benjamin Lincoln, who had surrendered Charleston. It's a pointed reminder of that earlier humiliation. The British are forced to acknowledge their surrendering to the Americans they've dismissed as rabble. The victory at Yorktown is total and crushing. An entire British army has been captured. It's the largest surrender of British forces between the surrender of Burgoyne at Saratoga and the Japanese surrender in 1945. The strategic impact is immediate and enormous. When news reaches London in late November, it causes a political earthquake. Lord North, the Prime Minister who has prosecuted the war, reportedly exclaims, "Oh God, it is all over." He's right. The British government and public have no stomach for continuing the war. They've spent 6 years and enormous treasure trying to suppress the rebellion. They've lost 2 armies completely, at Saratoga and Yorktown. The French, Spanish, and Dutch are all fighting against them. The war has become unsustainable. Parliament begins moving toward peace negotiations. North's government falls in March 1782. The new government immediately begins seeking terms to end the war. But the war doesn't end overnight. The fighting continues at a reduced level for another year and a half. British forces still occupy New York, Charleston, and Savannah. Small skirmishes occur. At sea, naval battles continue. The British desperately want to achieve some victory to strengthen their negotiating position, but nothing major develops. For Washington and the Continental Army, the period after Yorktown is frustrating. They've won a great victory but can't capitalize on it. The French fleet leaves to fight the British in the Caribbean. Without naval support, Washington can't attack the remaining British strongholds. His army settles into cantonment around Newburgh, New York. The conditions are terrible. Congress has no money to pay the troops or provide adequate supplies. Soldiers who have fought for years go unpaid. Some haven't been paid in months or even years. Resentment builds. In March 1783, anonymous letters circulate among the officers suggesting they should refuse to disband until Congress pays them. Some even suggest marching on Congress to demand payment. It's the threat of a military coup, American soldiers overthrowing the civilian government they fought to establish. Washington acts decisively. He calls a meeting of officers and delivers an emotional speech. He reminds them what they fought for, warns them that taking such action would destroy everything they've accomplished. He pulls out a letter to read and fumbles with glasses he's never worn in public before, saying, "Gentlemen, you must pardon me. I have grown gray in your service and now find myself growing blind." It's a powerful moment. These officers have followed Washington for 8 years through terrible hardships. Seeing him aged and struggling moves them deeply. The conspiracy collapses. The officers reaffirm their loyalty to civilian authority. It's a crucial moment in establishing the principle of civilian control over the military in America. Peace negotiations proceed in Paris. The American delegation includes Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay. They negotiate skillfully, playing European powers against each other. Britain wants to separate America from France and is willing to be generous to achieve it. The Treaty of Paris is signed on September 3, 1783. Britain recognizes American independence and grants the United States all territory south of Canada, north of Florida, and east of the Mississippi River. It's an incredible diplomatic achievement, far more territory than the 13 original colonies occupied. On November 25, 1783, the last British troops evacuate New York City. Washington and his officers enter the city in triumph. On December 4th, Washington meets with his officers at Francis Tavern for a final farewell. He's emotional, embracing each officer individually. Then he travels to Annapolis, Maryland, where Congress is meeting on December 23, 1783. In a ceremony carefully choreographed to emphasize civilian authority, Washington resigns his commission as commander-in-chief. He's relinquishing the power he's held for over 8 years. He's going home to Mount Vernon to be a private citizen. This act astonishes the world. Military commanders who win wars typically seize power. Caesar crossed the Rubicon. Cromwell became Lord Protector. Napoleon crowned himself emperor, but Washington voluntarily gives up power and returns to civilian life. King George III, when told Washington intends to resign and retire, reportedly says if Washington does that, he'll be the greatest man in the world. When we think of the American Revolution, we usually picture the major battles in Massachusetts, New York, Pennsylvania, and the Carolinas. But the war for independence was fought on many fronts that often get overlooked in the grand narrative. From the frontier wilderness to the high seas, from slave plantations to Native American villages, the revolution was far more complex and widespread than the traditional story suggests. Understanding these other theaters of war reveals the true scope and cost of American independence. Let's start on the western frontier, where a different kind of war was being fought. Beyond the Appalachian Mountains, settlers were pushing into lands that Native American tribes had inhabited for centuries. The revolution forced these tribes to choose sides in a conflict that would determine their future regardless of which side won. Most tribes allied with the British, a logical choice given that the British had tried to limit westward expansion while the colonists constantly pushed for more land. The proclamation of 1763 had forbidden settlement west of the Appalachians, angering colonists but reassuring tribes. Now, with the colonists in rebellion, the tribes saw the British as the lesser threat to their lands and way of life. The Iroquois Confederacy, the powerful alliance of 6 nations that had dominated the region for centuries, splits over the war. The Mohawk, Cayuga, Onondaga, and Seneca side with Britain. The Oneida and Tuscarora support the Americans. This split tears apart the Great League of Peace that had united the Iroquois for hundreds of years. Brother fights brother. Ancient alliances dissolve in blood. In 1778 and 1779, the frontier explodes in violence. British allied Iroquois warriors and Loyalist Rangers conduct devastating raids on American settlements in New York and Pennsylvania. The Wyoming Valley Massacre in Pennsylvania in July 1778 and the Cherry Valley Massacre in New York in November result in hundreds of civilian deaths. Settlers are killed, homes burned, crops destroyed. The frontier population is terrorized. Washington responds by sending General John Sullivan with over 4,000 troops on a punitive expedition into Iroquois territory in 1779. Sullivan's orders are to not merely defeat the Iroquois but to devastate their homeland so completely they can never threaten the frontier again. The expedition burns over 40 Iroquois villages, destroys vast stores of corn and other food supplies, cuts down orchards, and kills anyone who resists. It's a campaign of total war against a civilian population. Thousands of Iroquois become refugees, fleeing to British protection near Niagara. The power of the Iroquois Confederacy, which had made them the dominant force in the region for generations, is broken forever. In the Ohio Valley and further west, the fighting is equally brutal. George Rogers Clark, a Virginia militia officer, leads a daring campaign to capture British posts in what is now Illinois and Indiana. In 1778 and 1779, Clark's small force captures Kaskaskia, Cahokia, and Vincennes, bringing the vast Northwest Territory under American control, at least nominally. Clark's campaign is one of the most remarkable of the war. With fewer than 200 men, he marches through wilderness, survives a midwinter trek through flooded terrain, and captures fortified positions through bluff and audacity. His success gives the United States a claim to the Northwest Territory in peace negotiations, vastly expanding the new nation's borders. But American control of this territory is theoretical. Native tribes, particularly the Shawnee, Miami, and Delaware, continue resisting American settlement. This conflict will continue long after the Revolution ends, culminating in major defeats of American forces in the 1790s, before being finally resolved in the early 1800s. Meanwhile, in the South, the Revolution takes on an additional dimension of horror as the question of slavery becomes intertwined with the fight for independence. In November 1775, Lord Dunmore, the royal governor of Virginia, issues a proclamation offering freedom to any slave who escapes their rebel master and joins British forces. Thousands of enslaved people flee to British lines seeking freedom. The British don't issue this proclamation out of humanitarian concern for enslaved people. It's a military tactic designed to disrupt the Southern economy and deprive rebel planters of their labor force. But for the enslaved people who risk everything to reach British lines, the motivation doesn't matter. The British are offering what their rebel masters never would: freedom. Throughout the war, enslaved people escape to British camps. Some serve as laborers, some fight as soldiers. The British create regiments of formerly enslaved men, most notably the Ethiopian Regiment in Virginia and the black pioneers who served throughout the war. When the British evacuate at the end of the war, they take thousands of formerly enslaved people with them, resettling them in Nova Scotia, the Caribbean, and eventually Sierra Leone in Africa. White Southerners are outraged by this mass exodus of their human property. They demand these people be returned as per the Treaty of Paris. The British refuse, arguing that these people became free when they reached British lines and can't be returned to slavery. It's one of the points of conflict in post-war Anglo-American relations, for the enslaved people who didn't or couldn't escape. The revolution brings no improvement and sometimes makes conditions worse. Many plantations lack white men because they're away fighting. Discipline becomes harsher. Food becomes scarcer. Some enslaved people attempt rebellion, but these are brutally suppressed. The revolution's proclamations about liberty and natural rights ring hollow for people held in bondage by the very men writing those words. Some enslaved people fight for the American cause, either voluntarily or by being forced to serve as substitutes for their masters. Black soldiers serve in the Continental Army throughout the war. At the Battle of Rhode Island in 1778, a regiment of formerly enslaved men fights with distinction, but their service doesn't lead to widespread emancipation. Only in the northern states, where slavery is economically less important, does the revolution begin a gradual process of abolition. In the South, slavery not only continues but expands after the war. The ideals of the revolution are selectively applied. Liberty for white men doesn't extend to people of African descent, a contradiction that will haunt American history for another 80 years until it explodes in civil war. Now let's turn to the Naval War, where American forces face seemingly impossible odds. The Royal Navy is the most powerful maritime force in the world, with over 100 ships of the line and hundreds of smaller vessels. America has no navy at all when the war begins. Congress creates the Continental Navy, but it never grows beyond a handful of ships. Most American naval warfare is conducted by privateers, private ships authorized by Congress to attack British merchant vessels and keep the proceeds. Privateering is legalized piracy, and it proves remarkably effective. Over 2,000 American privateers capture or destroy about 600 British ships during the war. These aren't usually military victories but economic ones, disrupting British trade and making the war more expensive for Britain. Some American naval officers become legendary. John Paul Jones, commanding small ships, takes the fight to British waters, raiding the English and Scottish coasts. In September 1779, Jones commands the Bonhomme Richard in one of the war's most famous naval battles. Off the coast of England, he encounters the larger and more powerful British warship HMS Serapis in a brutal night battle. The two ships pound each other at point-blank range. Jones's ship is battered and sinking. When the British captain calls for him to surrender, Jones supposedly replies, "I have not yet begun to fight." After 3.5 hours of savage combat, the Serapis surrenders. Jones transfers his crew to the captured British ship as the Bonhomme Richard sinks. It's a spectacular victory that proves American sailors can match the Royal Navy in courage and skill. But individual victories can't overcome British naval superiority. Throughout the war, British ships blockade American ports, raid coastal towns, and transport troops wherever needed. American commerce is devastated. Imports become scarce and expensive. Only French naval intervention changes the equation. The French fleet, while not as large as Britain's, is modern and well commanded. When French ships challenge British control of American waters, it creates opportunities like the one that leads to victory at Yorktown. The war at sea also extends to the Caribbean, where both sides fight for control of valuable sugar islands. These islands are economically more important to European powers than the 13 colonies. Battles in the Caribbean involve large fleets and thousands of casualties, dwarfing most of the land battles in North America. In the South, the war's brutality reaches levels rarely seen in the northern campaigns. The conflict becomes deeply personal, neighbor against neighbor, brother against brother. Loyalist and patriot militias commit atrocities against each other's supporters. Farms are burned, families are terrorized. Summary executions are common. The cycle of revenge spirals out of control. British Colonel Banastre Tarleton, nicknamed Bloody Ban, leads a unit that becomes notorious for killing prisoners and burning property. The Patriots are not innocent either. They hang loyalists, confiscate property, and drive families into exile. Both sides believe they're fighting for survival, that compromise is impossible, that the other side deserves no mercy. The Partisan War in the Carolinas produces leaders whose tactics and brutality would be considered war crimes today. Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox, is celebrated in American mythology as a romantic figure. In reality, his campaign involves ambushes, assassinations, and the complete breakdown of conventional military conduct. Thomas Sumter, another partisan leader, is known for his refusal to take prisoners in certain situations. Andrew Pickens leads militia that kill Native American allies of the British, including women and children, in retribution for raids on settlements. The British and Loyalists respond with equal brutality. It's a dirty war with few heroes, where the line between soldier and murderer becomes blurred. The psychological scars last for generations. Families remember who burned their farm, who killed their father, who betrayed them to the enemy. In some areas, the violence continues even after Yorktown. Militia settle scores. Loyalists flee to British-held cities or to Canada, abandoning everything. Perhaps 50,000 loyalists eventually leave the United States, the largest political exile in American history until the Civil War. In the North, the war is different, but no less complex. Native American tribes in the region face impossible choices. The Stockbridge Indians of Massachusetts fight for the Americans and suffer heavy casualties. The Delaware initially try to remain neutral but are drawn into the conflict. In 1782, American militia massacre nearly 100 Christian Delaware at Gnadenhutten in Ohio. Despite these particular Delaware having no involvement in raids, the militia club, scalp and burn men, women and children who had converted to Christianity and adopted pacifism. It's one of the war's worst atrocities. Women play crucial roles often overlooked in traditional histories. They run farms and businesses while men are fighting. They serve as spies and couriers. Some, like Deborah Sampson, disguise themselves as men and serve as soldiers. Many follow the army as camp followers, cooking, washing, nursing the wounded. When their husbands are killed, some take up their weapons and continue fighting. Margaret Corbin and Mary Ludwig Hayes, known as Molly Pitcher, both operate artillery in battle after their husbands fall. Women endure hardships equal to men, with less recognition and no political rights in the nation being created. The revolution's promise of equality doesn't extend to them. They remain legally subordinate to men, unable to vote or own property in most cases. It will take another century and a half before American women gain full political rights. The economic war is as important as the military one. Britain tries to strangle American commerce. America survives partly through smuggling and partly through aid from France and other European powers. Inflation spirals out of control. The continental dollar becomes nearly worthless, giving rise to the phrase "not worth a continental." Soldiers go unpaid. Civilians struggle to afford necessities. Some grow wealthy through speculation and profiteering. Others are ruined. The economic disruption affects everyone but hits the poor hardest. These forgotten fronts of the revolution, the frontier wars, the naval campaigns, the southern partisan conflict, the plight of enslaved people, the struggles of Native Americans, women's contributions, reveal a war far more complex than the neat narrative of righteous colonists defeating tyrannical redcoats. The revolution was messy, brutal, and morally complicated. Understanding this complexity doesn't diminish the achievement of independence. If anything, it makes it more remarkable that a nation emerged from such chaos. Every revolution needs leaders, men and women who can inspire, organize, and sustain a movement through years of hardship and setback. The American Revolution was blessed with an extraordinary generation of leaders whose talents, personalities, and flaws shaped the course of the war and the nation that emerged from it. Understanding these individuals helps us understand how 13 fractious colonies managed to defeat the world's greatest empire. At the center stands George Washington, the man who held everything together when it seemed certain to fall apart. Washington wasn't the most brilliant military strategist. He lost more battles than he won. He made mistakes that cost lives, but he had qualities more important than tactical genius. He had patience, steadfast determination, and an ability to learn from defeat. Most crucially, he had the respect and loyalty of his men and the trust of Congress. Washington came from the Virginia planter aristocracy. He was wealthy, owned slaves, and had the bearing and manners of a gentleman. But unlike many aristocrats, he was willing to endure the same hardships as his troops. At Valley Forge, when his army was starving and freezing, Washington was there with them. He could have taken comfortable quarters, but he stayed in the field. His soldiers saw this and it mattered. They knew their commander shared their suffering. Washington's greatest military skill was knowing when not to fight. After the disasters of 1776, he understood that his primary mission was to keep the army intact. If the Continental Army survived, the rebellion survived. If the army was destroyed, the cause was lost. So Washington fought only when circumstances favored him or when political necessity demanded it. Otherwise, he retreated, preserved his force, and waited for opportunity. This strategy frustrated both the British, who couldn't force a decisive battle, and some American officers who wanted more aggressive action. But it worked. Washington kept the army in existence through years of campaigns. He was also politically astute. He maintained good relations with Congress even when they failed to provide adequate support. He deferred to civilian authority even when it made military operations more difficult. He understood that the revolution was fighting for the principle of self-government, which meant the military must be subordinate to elected representatives. After the war, his voluntary resignation of power set a precedent that shaped American civil-military relations forever. No American general after him seriously considers military dictatorship, because Washington didn't. His character, as much as his generalship, made independence possible. Benjamin Franklin was the revolution's diplomat and elder statesman. At 70 years old when the war began, He was already famous throughout Europe and America as a scientist, inventor, and writer. His experiments with electricity had made him a celebrity. His wit and wisdom, expressed in Poor Richard's Almanac and other writings, were widely quoted. Franklin was essential to securing French support. When he arrived in France in 1776 as American representative, he was treated like a rock star. French society embraced him as the embodiment of American virtue and natural philosophy. He played this role brilliantly, presenting himself as a simple American sage while conducting sophisticated diplomatic negotiations. Franklin understood French politics and knew how to work the system. He cultivated relationships with key officials, charmed influential women in Paris salons, and patiently built support for the American cause. When the French government hesitated to openly support rebellion, Franklin used a combination of logical argument and emotional appeal. He argued that supporting America would weaken Britain, France's ancient enemy, who warned that if France didn't help, America might reconcile with Britain, creating an even stronger rival. He appealed to French ideals of liberty and enlightenment. His efforts, combined with the American victory at Saratoga, convinced France to enter the war. During peace negotiations, Franklin was equally skillful. He played European powers against each other, securing terms far more favorable than America's military position warranted. The United States gained all territory east of the Mississippi, an enormous expansion beyond the 13 original colonies. Franklin's diplomacy was as important to victory as any battle. John Adams was the Revolution's theorist and advocate. A Massachusetts lawyer, Adams was brilliant, prickly, and absolutely committed to the cause of independence. He could be difficult to work with. He knew it and admitted it in his diary, but his contributions were immense. In Congress, Adams was the driving force pushing for independence. He argued, debated, and persuaded wavering delegates. When others counseled caution, Adams insisted on bold action. His speeches in favor of independence were so powerful that Thomas Jefferson later said, "Adams was the pillar of support on the floor of Congress, its ablest advocate and defender." Adams also contributed intellectually to shaping the new nation. His thoughts on government influenced multiple state constitutions. He argued for separation of powers, checks and balances, and the importance of the rule of law. These ideas would be incorporated into the federal constitution. During the war, Adams served on numerous committees, often handling tedious administrative work that others avoided. He helped create the Continental Navy, develop military strategy, and manage foreign affairs. After the war, he joined Franklin in Paris for peace negotiations, where his stubbornness and attention to detail helped secure favorable terms. Adams lacked Washington's dignity, Franklin's charm, and Jefferson's eloquence, but his intelligence, work ethic, and unwavering commitment made him indispensable. The revolution needed someone willing to do the unglamorous work, fight the bureaucratic battles, and never compromise on principles. Adams was that person. Thomas Jefferson contributed the words that defined the revolution. His Declaration of Independence gave the struggle a philosophical foundation that transcended immediate grievances. Jefferson was young, only 33 when he wrote the Declaration, and somewhat shy. He wasn't a great orator like Patrick Henry, but he could write with grace and power that moved hearts and minds. The Declaration's statement of universal principles that all men are created equal and possess unalienable rights became the foundation for American democracy and an inspiration for liberation movements worldwide. Jefferson's vision extended beyond winning the war. He thought deeply about what kind of nation America should become. He championed religious freedom, public education, and democratic participation. He opposed concentrations of power and privilege. His ideals weren't always consistent with his actions. He owned slaves throughout his life and never freed most of them. But his vision of America shaped the nation's aspirations. During the war, Jefferson served as governor of Virginia. His record there was mixed. When British forces raided Virginia in 1781, Jefferson was criticized for inadequate military preparation, but he contributed to the war effort by keeping Virginia's government functioning and supplies flowing to the Continental Army. After the war, Jefferson continued shaping the nation as diplomat, Secretary of State, Vice President, and President. Alexander Hamilton was the Revolution's financial genius and Washington's indispensable aide. Born in the Caribbean as an illegitimate child, Hamilton came to New York as a teenager with nothing but intelligence and ambition. When war began, he joined the army and quickly distinguished himself. Washington noticed the young officer's abilities and made him his aide-de-camp for 4 years. Hamilton served as Washington's chief of staff, writing correspondence, coordinating with other officers, and helping develop strategy. He was essentially Washington's brain trust, one of the most important positions in the Continental Army. Hamilton craved military glory and finally got his chance at Yorktown, where he led the assault on Redoubt 10. After the war, Hamilton's greatest contributions came in creating the financial foundations of the new nation. As first Secretary of the Treasury, he established the National Bank, assumed state debts, and created a system of public credit that made the United States economically viable. Without Hamilton's financial system, the nation might have collapsed economically. The Marquis de Lafayette represents foreign volunteers who embraced the American cause. A wealthy young French nobleman, Lafayette was only 19 when he sailed to America in 1777 to volunteer for the Continental Army. He wasn't seeking adventure or glory, though he found both. He genuinely believed in the principles of the Revolution and wanted to fight for liberty. Washington developed a fatherly affection for Lafayette, and the young Frenchman became one of his most trusted commanders. Lafayette served throughout the war, often using his own fortune to supply his troops when Congress couldn't. He was wounded at Brandywine, endured Valley Forge, and commanded troops in the Virginia campaign that ended at Yorktown. His presence helped cement French support for the Revolution. When he returned to France, he was a hero who had fought for liberty in America. Lafayette later played a significant role in the early stages of the French Revolution, attempting to create a constitutional monarchy. He never forgot his American experience and remained friends with Washington until the latter's death. Nathanael Greene was Washington's most capable general, a Rhode Island Quaker who overcame his pacifist upbringing to become a soldier. Greene had no military training when the war began, but he studied warfare intensively and proved to be a natural strategist. Washington trusted Greene more than any other general and frequently gave him the most difficult assignments. Greene commanded the American forces in the South from 1780 to 1783, and his campaign there was a masterpiece of strategic warfare. Outnumbered and under-resourced, Greene avoided major battles he couldn't win while constantly maneuvering to wear down the British. His famous quote, "We fight, get beat, rise and fight again," perfectly captures his approach. Greene didn't need to win every battle. He just needed to make the British campaign so costly they couldn't sustain it. By the time Cornwallis surrendered at Yorktown, Greene had liberated most of the South without winning a single major tactical victory. It was brilliant generalship that deserves more recognition than it usually receives. Benedict Arnold is remembered as America's most infamous traitor. But before his betrayal, he was one of the Revolution's best combat commanders. Arnold led the expedition to Quebec in 1775, a brutal march through Maine wilderness in winter. The attack on Quebec failed, but Arnold's leadership under extreme conditions was remarkable. At Saratoga, Arnold's aggressive tactics were crucial to the American victory. Even though he'd been relieved of command after quarreling with General Gates, Arnold fought anyway, rallying troops and leading charges that broke the British lines. He was wounded badly but had helped secure the victory that brought France into the war. Why did Arnold turn traitor? Multiple factors contributed. He'd been passed over for promotion despite his battlefield successes. Congress investigated his finances when he served as military governor of Philadelphia. He felt unappreciated and disrespected. He married a woman from a loyalist family who encouraged his resentment. He was also in debt and motivated partly by the money the British offered. In 1780, Arnold conspired to surrender West Point, a key American fortress, to the British. The plot was discovered when his British contact, Major John Andre, was captured. Arnold fled to British lines and spent the rest of the war fighting for the British. His betrayal devastated American morale and enraged Washington personally. Arnold lived the rest of his life in Britain and Canada, despised by Americans and never fully trusted by the British. He died embittered and largely forgotten. His story shows how personal grievances and wounded pride can override principle. Patrick Henry was the Revolution's voice, the orator whose words stirred men to action. His speech to the Virginia Convention in March 1775 ended with the famous declaration, "Give me liberty or give me death." Henry understood how to move crowds, how to appeal to emotion as well as reason. His speeches helped overcome the cautious conservatism that made many colonists reluctant to support revolution. Henry served as Virginia's governor during the war, keeping the state functioning and supporting the Continental Army. He wasn't a military leader or a diplomat, but his ability to inspire and persuade was crucial in building support for independence. Samuel Adams was the Revolution's organizer and agitator. A failed businessman but brilliant political operator, Sam Adams spent years before the war building networks of resistance in Massachusetts. He organized the Sons of Liberty, coordinated protests, wrote propaganda, and orchestrated events like the Boston Tea Party. Adams was a master of publicity. He knew how to create incidents that would generate outrage and unite opposition to British policy. The Boston Massacre, a tragic but relatively minor clash, became a rallying cry because of Adams's propaganda efforts. Adams represented a type crucial to any revolution, the professional radical who dedicates his life to the cause. He was less important during the actual war than in creating the conditions that made it possible. These leaders had different talents, personalities, and motivations. They often disagreed with each other. Some were rivals, but they shared a commitment to independence that sustained the revolution through its darkest moments. Without Washington's steadiness, Franklin's diplomacy, Adams's advocacy, Jefferson's vision, Hamilton's brilliance, Greene's strategy, and the contributions of dozens of other leaders, independence would have been impossible. The revolution succeeded because it had the leadership necessary to turn abstract ideals into practical reality. Britain lost the American Revolution despite having every apparent advantage. Understanding why the world's greatest empire failed to suppress a colonial rebellion reveals fundamental truths about the limits of military power and the nature of revolutionary warfare. The British didn't lose because they were weak or incompetent. They lost because they were fighting an impossible war with strategies that couldn't work. Let's examine the multiple factors that doomed Britain's attempt to retain America. First, distance. Britain was fighting a war 3,000 miles across the Atlantic Ocean. In the 18th century, this was an almost insurmountable obstacle. Messages took weeks or months to travel between London and America. Orders from British officials arrived outdated. Commanders in America couldn't respond quickly to changing circumstances because by the time they asked for instructions and received them, the situation had completely changed. Every soldier, every musket ball, every uniform, every supply had to be shipped across the Atlantic. Ships were at the mercy of weather, storms sinking transports with men and supplies. The Atlantic crossing took 6 to 8 weeks under good conditions, longer in winter or bad weather. A British army in America was constantly dependent on a supply line stretching thousands of miles. By contrast, the Americans were fighting at home. Their supply lines were short. They could draw on local resources. They knew the terrain intimately. They could retreat into familiar countryside and disappear, while British troops were always in foreign territory where every civilian might be an enemy. Second, the sheer size of America. Britain was trying to occupy and pacify a territory of over 300,000 square miles. That's larger than Britain, Ireland, and France combined. The population was spread out across this vast area, in hundreds of towns and countless farms. To actually control this territory would require an army of hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions, stationed in garrisons throughout the continent. Britain never had more than 50,000 troops in America at any one time, and most of those were concentrated in a few cities. They could occupy cities like New York, Philadelphia, Charleston, but they couldn't control the countryside. Every time they marched away from their bases, they entered hostile territory. Every supply convoy needed guards. Every outpost was vulnerable to attack. The British could win battles, capture cities, and control specific areas, but they couldn't be everywhere. And in areas where they weren't present, American authority reasserted itself. Third, the nature of the conflict. This wasn't a conventional war between nation-states fighting for limited objectives. This was a revolutionary war for independence. The Americans weren't trying to conquer Britain or even defeat the British army in a decisive battle. They just needed to survive, to keep resisting until Britain gave up. The British, on the other hand, needed total victory. They needed to destroy the Continental Army, capture the rebel leaders, occupy enough territory to suppress resistance, and restore royal authority. Anything less than complete victory was defeat. This asymmetry meant the Americans could lose battles and still win the war, as long as they kept fighting. The British could win battles and still lose the war if they couldn't convert tactical victories into strategic success. Fourth, the political dimension. Britain wasn't fighting a foreign enemy but its own citizens. Many in Britain, including prominent politicians and military officers, sympathized with American grievances, or at least questioned whether the war was worth fighting. The British public had to be convinced that the war was necessary and winnable. Every defeat, every setback, every year without victory strengthened opposition to the war in Parliament and among the public. The government had to balance spending on the war against other priorities and against public patience. By contrast, the Americans were fighting for survival. Giving up meant execution for treason. The stakes couldn't be higher. This made the American side more willing to endure hardship and sacrifice. Fifth, British military strategy was fundamentally flawed. British commanders thought in terms of European warfare, where capturing the enemy capital and destroying his army ended the war. They captured Philadelphia, expecting Congress to collapse. Congress simply moved. They destroyed multiple American armies, expecting the rebellion to end. New armies formed. They couldn't understand a war where traditional military victories didn't produce political results. The British also overestimated loyalist support. They believed large numbers of colonists would actively support the crown once British troops protected them from rebel intimidation. This proved largely false. Loyalists existed but were a minority in most areas, and even loyalists weren't willing to fight without British military support. When British armies moved through an area, loyalists might emerge. When the army moved on, loyalists were left vulnerable to rebel retaliation. British strategy in the South depended on mobilizing loyalist militia to hold territory while the regular army moved forward. But loyalist militia proved unreliable. They could win against other militia but were no match for Continental regulars or determined partisan bands. Relying on loyalists led to disasters like King's Mountain, where an entire loyalist force was destroyed. Sixth, logistics defeated Britain as much as American arms. Supplying an army in America was a nightmare. Food, ammunition, equipment, everything had to be transported enormous distances. The Royal Navy controlled the seas but couldn't be everywhere. American privateers captured hundreds of supply ships. Even when supplies reached American ports, getting them to armies in the field was difficult. American forces destroyed bridges, blocked roads, and harassed supply convoys. British armies frequently outran their supply lines. Cornwallis's invasion of North Carolina failed partly because he couldn't keep his army fed and supplied so far from his base. The Americans had supply problems too, but they could supplement official supplies with local resources. British troops depended entirely on what their logistics system provided. 7th, Britain was fighting multiple enemies simultaneously. After France entered the war in 1778, Britain had to defend its interests globally. Spain joined in 1779, the Netherlands in 1780. Suddenly, Britain faced threats in the Caribbean, Gibraltar, India, and home waters, as well as North America. The Royal Navy, which had dominated American waters, had to split its forces to fight the French fleet in multiple theaters. British troops stationed in America might be needed elsewhere. Strategic decisions had to account for worldwide British interests, not just the American situation. The Americans became less important to British strategy as threats from European powers increased. Resources that might have gone to crushing the American rebellion had to be diverted to protecting more economically valuable territories like the Sugar Islands of the Caribbean. 8th, British commanders often failed to coordinate effectively. The Saratoga Campaign collapsed because Howe went to Philadelphia instead of marching up the Hudson to meet Burgoyne. Clinton in New York didn't effectively support Cornwallis in Virginia. Part of this was the distance and communication problem mentioned earlier, but part was personality conflicts and lack of unified command. British generals were ambitious, jealous of each other, and sometimes more interested in personal glory than winning the war. They also underestimated their enemy. British officers, trained in European warfare and accustomed to fighting professional armies, looked at American militia with contempt. They saw farmers in homemade uniforms and expected them to break and run. Sometimes they did, but often they didn't. The British kept being surprised that Americans could fight effectively. This led to tactical mistakes, like Burgoyne's overconfidence at Saratoga or Cornwallis's underestimation of Greene's abilities. 9th, the war was economically unsustainable for Britain. The cost was enormous. Britain's national debt, already huge from the 7 Years' War, doubled again. Taxes had to be raised in Britain to pay for a war that wasn't producing results. Trade was disrupted. American privateers captured British merchant ships, damaging commerce. The war with France, Spain, and the Netherlands made everything worse. The economic burden turned British public opinion against the war. After 6 years of fighting without decisive results, with costs mounting and no end in sight, the British public and Parliament lost the will to continue. When Cornwallis surrendered at Yorktown, it was militarily significant but not absolutely decisive. Britain still had armies in New York, Charleston, and Savannah. They could have continued fighting, but politically it was the end. Lord North's government fell. The new government immediately sought peace. The British people had had enough. 10th, American advantages that aren't always appreciated. The Continental Army, for all its problems with supply and pay, was fighting for a cause its soldiers believed in. British soldiers were professionals doing their job, often far from home, fighting for a king they'd never seen to suppress people whose grievances seemed reasonable to many of them. Morale matters in war. An army that believes in its cause will endure hardships that mercenaries won't. The American population, even those who didn't actively fight, generally supported the revolution or at least accepted it. They provided intelligence, supplies, and sanctuary to American forces. The British operated in a hostile environment where civilians were unreliable sources of information and potential enemies. The Continental Congress, despite all its weaknesses, managed to keep the revolution organized and supplied well enough. They borrowed money, negotiated alliances, maintained diplomatic relations, and kept state governments cooperating, more or less. It was often chaotic and inefficient, but it worked well enough. Britain also suffered from failure of imagination. They couldn't conceive that their empire could actually lose to colonial rebels. This led to repeated underestimation of American resolve and capabilities. When one strategy failed, they tried variations of the same approach rather than fundamentally rethinking their assumptions. The Southern strategy was just a geographic variation of the failed Northern strategy: occupy territory, rely on loyalists, crush the rebellion piece by piece. It failed for the same reasons the Northern campaigns failed, but British commanders kept expecting different results. Finally, luck and timing played crucial roles. The French decision to enter the war came at a critical moment when American morale was low. If France had waited another year, the revolution might have collapsed. The victory at Saratoga, which convinced France to join, came about partly through Burgoyne's mistakes and partly through American tactical skill. It could have gone differently. At Yorktown, de Grasse's fleet arrived at exactly the right moment. If the British fleet had defeated the French, Cornwallis would have been reinforced and evacuated. The trap would have failed. Tiny events, individual decisions, whether all influenced the outcome. In retrospect, we can see that Britain's task was nearly impossible. They had to not merely defeat the Americans militarily but to crush their will to resist across an entire continent while fighting other enemies, with public support at home eroding. The Americans only had to survive until Britain gave up. Every year the war continued without British victory strengthened the American position and weakened Britain's. The revolution succeeded not because it was inevitable but because American leadership was good enough. French support was timely enough, and British strategy was flawed enough that the impossible became possible. Understanding why Britain lost doesn't diminish the American achievement. It shows how a weaker power with strong motivation, effective leadership, foreign support, and a viable strategy can defeat a stronger power. These lessons would influence revolutionary movements and asymmetric warfare for centuries to come. The American Revolution proved that empires aren't invincible and that people fighting for their independence can overcome enormous odds. Victory came at an enormous price. When the last British troops sailed from New York in November 1783, Americans celebrated their independence. But the 8-year struggle had devastated the economy, killed tens of thousands, divided families, destroyed property, and left deep scars that would take generations to heal. Understanding the true cost of the revolution reveals what Americans sacrificed to create their new nation. The human toll was staggering. Approximately 25,000 American soldiers died during the war. Only about 8,000 died in combat. The rest succumbed to disease, exposure, and the brutal conditions of military life in the 18th century. Camp diseases like typhus, dysentery, and smallpox killed more soldiers than British muskets. Wounded men often died from infection because medical knowledge was primitive and battlefield surgery was crude. Military hospitals were death traps where disease spread rapidly among the wounded and sick. For every soldier who died, many more were permanently injured. Men lost limbs to cannonballs or amputation. They were blinded, crippled, or left with chronic health problems from wounds and diseases. There was no veterans care system, no disability benefits, no hospitals for wounded soldiers. Men who had given their health and strength to the cause often ended their lives as beggars. The psychological trauma was immense, though nobody called it that then. Men who had seen friends killed beside them, who had killed other men, who had survived starvation and disease, carried those experiences the rest of their lives. Some couldn't readjust to civilian life. Some became violent or withdrew from society. Families were shattered by the war. Sons, fathers, and brothers went off to fight and never returned. Women became widows, children became orphans. The social fabric of communities was torn apart when neighbors chose different sides. Patriots and loyalists had been friends, relatives, business partners. Now they were enemies. Families split down the middle, brother fighting brother, father against son. These divisions lasted for generations. In some communities, people refused to speak to former loyalists or their descendants for decades. The economic destruction was catastrophic. 8 years of war disrupted trade, destroyed property, and crippled the economy. British blockades cut off international commerce. American ships were captured. Merchants went bankrupt. Coastal towns that depended on trade withered. Agriculture was devastated in areas where armies fought. Soldiers from both sides stripped farms of food, livestock, and crops. Armies trampled fields, burned barns, slaughtered animals. Farmers couldn't plant or harvest when fighting was nearby. Years of war meant years of lost production. The South suffered particularly severe damage from the scorched earth tactics and partisan warfare. Plantations were burned, slave populations disrupted, infrastructure destroyed. It took decades for Southern agriculture to recover. The Continental Congress had financed the war partly through issuing paper money. They printed money to pay for supplies and soldiers' wages, but with no hard currency backing it and no taxation power to redeem it, continental currency became worthless. Inflation spiraled out of control. By 1781, continental dollars were worth about 1 cent on the dollar. People who had accepted continental currency or war bonds in good faith saw their savings evaporate. Soldiers who fought for years and were paid in continental currency found it worthless when they tried to use it after the war. The phrase "not worth a continental" entered American language as a synonym for worthless. The states had also issued their own paper money and bonds, many of which became equally worthless. Ordinary people who had lent money or goods to the war effort, who had accepted government promises of payment, were ruined financially. Some speculators who bought up worthless currency and bonds at pennies on the dollar and later redeemed them at full value made fortunes, but most people lost. Property was confiscated on a massive scale. Patriot governments seized property of loyalists who fled or were driven out. Some of this property was sold to finance the war. Some was given to military officers and soldiers as payment. In many cases, the confiscations were essentially legalized theft. Prominent loyalists lost everything they owned, not because they had committed crimes, but because they chose the losing side. About 60 to 80,000 loyalists fled the United States during and after the war. That's about 3% of the total population. Imagine 3% of America's current population going into exile. That's about 10 million people. These weren't just wealthy elites. They were farmers, craftsmen, merchants, professionals, people whose families had lived in America for generations. Many went to Canada, where they founded new settlements in Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and Ontario. Others went to Britain, the Caribbean, or other British territories. Most never saw their homes again. They became refugees, forced to start over with whatever they could carry. Even loyalists who stayed faced discrimination, violence, and economic ruin. Some states passed laws barring them from voting, holding office, or practicing certain professions. The Treaty of Paris included provisions protecting loyalist property rights, but these were largely ignored. The war destroyed infrastructure throughout the country. Roads that had been poor to begin with were wrecked by years of military traffic. Bridges were burned, ports were damaged. Public buildings were destroyed or left in disrepair. There was no money to rebuild. The national debt was enormous. Congress owed money to soldiers, to domestic creditors who had lent supplies and money, and to foreign powers, particularly France. The states had their own debts. Total debt was about $70 million, an astronomical sum for a poor country with a population under 4 million. The new nation had no way to pay this debt. Congress had no power to tax. It could only request money from the states, which often refused or delayed. The national government was bankrupt and powerless. For soldiers who had fought the war, the aftermath was often bitter. They had been promised pay and benefits. Many received little or nothing. Some returned home after years away to find their farms foreclosed, their families in poverty, their property seized for unpaid taxes. The very men who had won independence now faced economic ruin in the independent nation they had created. In Massachusetts in 1786, this led to Shays' Rebellion. When groups of war veterans took up arms to stop foreclosures and debt collections, the rebellion was suppressed, but it revealed deep economic distress and social tensions. The revolution's political ideals clashed with harsh realities. The Declaration of Independence proclaimed that all men are created equal, but slavery continued and in some ways was strengthened after the war. The northern states began gradual abolition processes, but the South recommitted to slavery as the foundation of its economy. The contradiction between the revolution's principles and the reality of slavery was obvious to everyone but was pushed aside. Dealing with it would split the fragile Union, so it was postponed. Native American tribes that had sided with Britain faced catastrophe. The Treaty of Paris gave the United States all land east of the Mississippi without consulting the tribes who actually lived there. American settlers flooded into these territories, seizing land and ignoring tribal rights. Tribes that resisted faced military expeditions that destroyed their villages and forced them westward. The revolution that promised liberty to Americans brought dispossession and suffering to native peoples. Women who had contributed to the war effort gained no political rights. They couldn't vote, couldn't hold office, couldn't serve on juries, had limited property rights. The revolution's rhetoric about equality and natural rights didn't extend to them. Some women, particularly educated women who had tasted independence during the war when they ran farms and businesses, found the return to subordinate status frustrating. Abigail Adams famously wrote to her husband John, asking him to remember the ladies when creating the new government. He laughed it off. The economic chaos created social instability and class tensions. The rich often became richer through speculation and connections. The poor became poorer. The middle class was squeezed by debt and inflation. Veterans felt betrayed when their sacrifices weren't rewarded. Tensions between classes, regions, and interest groups threatened to tear apart the fragile Union. The political structure under the Articles of Confederation, adopted in 1781, proved inadequate. Congress couldn't tax, couldn't regulate commerce, couldn't enforce its decisions. The states acted like 13 separate countries, each pursuing its own interests. Some issued their own currency. They imposed tariffs on goods from other states. They refused to contribute to national expenses. The weakness of the national government became increasingly apparent. Foreign nations didn't respect American sovereignty. Britain refused to evacuate forts in the Northwest Territory as promised in the peace treaty. Spain closed the Mississippi River to American commerce. Pirates from North African states captured American ships and enslaved their crews because America had no navy to protect them. The revolution had won independence but hadn't created a functional nation. The Union was falling apart. By the mid-1780s, many revolutionary leaders feared that all their sacrifices would be wasted. They had defeated the British Empire only to see the United States collapse into 13 squabbling states, too weak to defend themselves or maintain order. Something had to be done. This crisis led to the Constitutional Convention of 1787, where delegates would attempt to create a stronger national government. But that's another story. For ordinary Americans in the 1780s, the cost of independence was all too clear. They had won their freedom but faced economic hardship, social instability, and an uncertain future. The revolution had destroyed the old order without creating a functional new one. The grand principles of liberty and equality existed on paper but hadn't been realized in practice. Many people questioned whether the cost had been worth it. Had they traded benign British rule for chaos and poverty? The answer wouldn't be clear for years. What sustained Americans through this difficult period was the belief that they had done something unprecedented and important. They had thrown off colonial rule and declared their right to self-government. They had proved that ordinary people could govern themselves without kings or aristocrats. The principles stated in the Declaration of Independence, however imperfectly realized, gave them a foundation to build on. The revolution was incomplete. It had won independence but hadn't resolved fundamental questions about slavery, about the rights of women and Native Americans, about the distribution of wealth and power. These questions would continue to challenge and shape American history. But the revolution had established that these questions should be decided by Americans themselves, not by a distant monarch or parliament. The cost of independence was high, measured in blood, treasure, and suffering. Tens of thousands died. The economy was shattered. Society was disrupted. Families were torn apart. The price was paid not just by soldiers but by civilians, by women and children, by enslaved people and Native Americans, by everyone touched by the war. Yet Americans had gained something precious: the right to shape their own destiny. They had proven that colonized people could overthrow imperial rule. They had demonstrated that government by consent was possible. They had created a republic in an age of monarchies, declared principles of equality in a world of hierarchy, asserted natural rights in a time of inherited privilege. The immediate aftermath of the revolution was disappointing and difficult. The promised land of liberty and prosperity seemed distant. But the foundation had been laid. The United States, for all its problems and contradictions, was an independent nation. Its future was unwritten. Americans would have the opportunity and the responsibility to determine what their independence meant and what kind of nation they would build. That opportunity, purchased with such sacrifice, was the true meaning of the revolution. The cost was terrible, but what they had won was priceless: the chance to create something new in human history, a government of, by, and for the people. Whether they could actually achieve that vision remained to be seen. But they had won the right to try. That was what the cost of freedom had purchased. The American Revolution didn't end when the Treaty of Paris was signed or when Washington resigned his commission. Its impact rippled outward, transforming not just America but the entire world. The ideas unleashed by the revolution, the example it set, and the nation it created would influence human history for centuries to come. Understanding the revolution's legacy helps us see why this 8-year conflict in a handful of colonies mattered so profoundly. The most immediate and obvious legacy was the creation of the United States itself. For the first time in modern history, a group of colonies had successfully thrown off imperial rule and established an independent nation. This wasn't supposed to be possible. Colonies existed to serve the mother country. Rebellions were supposed to be crushed. Yet here was America, independent and determined to survive. The United States proved that colonial independence was achievable, that empires weren't permanent, that people could govern themselves. This example would inspire independence movements across Latin America in the early 19th century, in Africa and Asia in the 20th century. Everywhere colonized people sought freedom, they looked to the American example. The revolution established principles that became foundational to modern democracy. The Declaration of Independence stated that governments derive their power from the consent of the governed, that people possess natural rights that governments must respect, that when governments become tyrannical, people have the right to alter or abolish them. These weren't entirely new ideas. Philosophers like John Locke had proposed similar concepts, but the Americans put them into practice. They didn't just theorize about popular sovereignty. They created a government based on it. The Constitution, written in 1787 to replace the inadequate Articles of Confederation, created a republic with elected representatives, separation of powers, checks and balances, and protection for individual rights through the Bill of Rights. It wasn't perfect. It excluded women, enslaved people, and Native Americans from full participation, but it established principles that could be expanded over time. The Constitution became a model for democratic governments worldwide. Countries creating or reforming their governments studied American constitutional structures. The idea of a written constitution limiting government power, of federalism balancing national and local authority, of judicial review allowing courts to strike down unconstitutional laws, all became features of democracies around the world. The American Revolution influenced the French Revolution directly and profoundly. French soldiers who fought alongside Americans in the Revolutionary War, including Lafayette, returned to France with ideas about liberty and equality. They had seen a society without hereditary aristocracy, where men of common birth could achieve political and military leadership based on merit. When France erupted in revolution in 1789, American ideas and examples were part of the intellectual foundation. The French Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen echoed the American Declaration of Independence. The French revolutionaries saw themselves as following the American example, throwing off tyranny and establishing government based on the will of the people. Of course, the French Revolution took a far more radical and violent path than the American one, but the American example helped inspire it. The revolution transformed the concept of citizenship and political participation. In the colonial period, political power was limited to property-owning men. Even in America, many colonists couldn't vote or hold office. The revolution didn't immediately create universal suffrage, but it expanded political participation and established the principle that government should represent all the people, not just the elite. Over time, this principle led to expanding voting rights. Property requirements for voting were gradually eliminated. By the 1820s and 1830s, most white men could vote regardless of property ownership. It took much longer for women, African Americans, and other excluded groups to gain voting rights. But the revolutionary principle that legitimate government requires popular consent provided the foundation for these later expansions of democracy. The revolution's rhetoric about equality and natural rights, even though not fully realized in practice, created a standard by which American society could be judged and reformed. Abolitionists fighting slavery, women's rights activists, civil rights leaders, all appealed to the principles stated in the Declaration of Independence. How could America claim all men are created equal while holding millions in slavery? How could it proclaim liberty while denying women political rights? The revolution created ideals that America continually struggled to live up to, and that struggle drove social progress. The revolution demonstrated that republican government could work on a large scale. Ancient republics like Rome and Athens were small city-states. European thinkers believed republics couldn't function in large territories, that only monarchy could govern extensive lands. America proved them wrong. The United States was geographically huge and growing. Its population was diverse, spread across a vast area. Yet republican government not only survived but thrived. This overturned centuries of political theory and showed that democracy wasn't limited to small city-states. The revolution established the principle of religious freedom. The Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, written by Jefferson and passed in 1786, declared that no one could be compelled to attend or support any church. The First Amendment to the Constitution prohibited Congress from establishing a national religion or interfering with free exercise of religion. This was revolutionary. In most of the world, governments had official religions. Religious minorities faced discrimination or persecution. America established that government should be neutral in religious matters, that people should be free to worship or not worship as they chose. This principle of separation of church and state became a model for secular democracies worldwide. The revolution proved that ordinary people could govern themselves competently. European aristocrats believed that government required training, education, and breeding that only the upper classes possessed. Common people were too ignorant, too selfish, too easily swayed by passion to participate in government. America demonstrated this was false. Farmers, merchants, craftsmen could hold office, make laws, and govern effectively. They made mistakes, certainly, but no worse than hereditary rulers. The success of American democracy challenged the entire concept of hereditary aristocracy and divine right monarchy. If Americans could govern themselves, why couldn't everyone? The revolution's economic impact was profound. Breaking free from British mercantile restrictions allowed American commerce to expand. American ships could trade with any nation, not just within the British Empire. New markets opened. American manufacturing began to develop without British competition crushing it. The United States became an economic power that would eventually rival and surpass Britain. The revolution also established patterns of economic development based on private enterprise and limited government interference in the economy. While debates about the proper role of government in economic affairs continued, the American model generally favored free enterprise and entrepreneurship. This economic philosophy would become dominant globally in later centuries. The revolution had significant impact on slavery, though not the one we might hope for. Some northern states began gradual abolition during and after the revolution. The contradiction between revolutionary principles and slavery became impossible to ignore. How could America proclaim liberty while practicing slavery? Northern states, where slavery was economically less important, responded by starting to abolish it. But in the South, slavery became more entrenched. The invention of the cotton gin in 1793 made cotton cultivation enormously profitable and increased demand for slave labor. The South's commitment to slavery deepened even as the North moved toward abolition. The revolution thus set America on a path toward sectional conflict that would eventually explode in civil war. Yet the revolution also planted the seeds of slavery's destruction. The principles of equality and natural rights provided ammunition for abolitionists. The Declaration's assertion that all men are created equal would be used by Frederick Douglass, Abraham Lincoln, and countless others to argue that slavery violated America's founding principles. The revolution changed the status and expectations of women, though not as much as many women hoped. During the war, women had taken on new responsibilities, running farms and businesses, organizing boycotts, serving as spies and couriers. Some had even fought disguised as men. This experience gave many women a taste of independence and responsibility beyond traditional domestic roles. After the war, most women returned to subordinate legal and social status, but the revolution had opened questions about women's rights that wouldn't be closed. If the revolution was fought for liberty and equality, why didn't those principles apply to women? The answer wasn't satisfactory, and women began organizing to claim their rights. The Seneca Falls Convention in 1848, which launched the organized women's rights movement, explicitly modeled its declaration of sentiments on the Declaration of Independence. The revolution's impact on Native Americans was devastating. The new United States claimed all land east of the Mississippi, ignoring tribal sovereignty and treaty rights. American settlers flooded into tribal territories, seizing land and resources. Tribes that resisted faced military campaigns of extermination or forced removal. The revolution that brought liberty to white Americans brought dispossession and suffering to native peoples. This tragic legacy would continue throughout American history as the nation expanded westward. The revolution established America's complicated relationship with military force. The revolutionaries feared standing armies as threats to liberty. They preferred citizen militias, yet they also learned that militia alone couldn't win wars against professional armies. The solution was a small regular army supplemented by state militia. This tension between military necessity and fear of military power shaped American defense policy. The revolution also established the principle of civilian control over the military, exemplified by Washington's Resignation. American military officers wouldn't seize political power. They would serve civilian leaders elected by the people. The revolution made America a beacon for refugees and immigrants. The United States represented opportunity, freedom from persecution, the chance to start over. Millions of people from around the world would immigrate to America over the next 2 centuries. Drawn by the promise of liberty and opportunity the revolution proclaimed, this immigration transformed America into one of the most diverse nations on earth and became central to American identity. The revolution established a pattern of American acceptance. Americans came to see their nation as special, uniquely blessed with liberty and opportunity, with a mission to spread democracy and freedom. This belief would drive American foreign policy, sometimes for good and sometimes for ill. Americans would feel called to support liberation movements, to oppose tyranny, to promote democracy. This sense of mission could lead to noble actions like opposing Nazi Germany or to misguided interventions in other nations' affairs. The revolution created a national mythology that shaped American culture and identity. Stories of patriot heroes like Washington, Paul Revere, Nathan Hale became part of American folklore. Events like the Boston Tea Party, the Midnight Ride, Valley Forge became symbolic of American courage and determination. These stories, often simplified or romanticized, helped create a shared national identity among diverse populations. The revolution established precedents for how Americans would handle political change and conflict. Despite deep divisions, Americans used constitutional and legal processes rather than violence to resolve most disputes. The peaceful transfer of power between political parties, established when Jefferson's Democratic Republicans defeated Adams's Federalists in 1800, became a fundamental feature of American democracy. The revolution showed that political opponents weren't enemies to be destroyed but fellow citizens with different views. The global impact of the American Revolution extended beyond inspiring other independence movements. It challenged the legitimacy of monarchy and empire everywhere. It demonstrated that republican government could be stable and effective. It showed that written constitutions could limit government power and protect individual rights. These lessons influenced political development worldwide. The revolution had intellectual impact through the writings of revolutionary leaders. The Federalist Papers, written by Hamilton, Madison, and Jay to promote ratification of the Constitution, became classic texts of political philosophy studied around the world. Jefferson's writings on democracy and natural rights, Adams's works on government, Franklin's practical wisdom, all influenced political thought far beyond America. The American experiment attracted attention from European intellectuals who saw it as testing Enlightenment theories about human nature and government. The revolution proved that nations could be created deliberately through reason and planning rather than evolving slowly through tradition. The Constitution was a consciously designed political system, not an accumulated collection of customs and precedents. This showed that societies could reform themselves rationally, that progress was possible through human effort and reason. The legacy of the American Revolution is complex and sometimes contradictory. It established principles of liberty and equality that it didn't fully practice. It created opportunities for some while destroying them for others. It inspired democratic movements while also inspiring American imperial expansion. It proclaimed universal human rights while accepting slavery and excluding many from full citizenship. Yet for all its contradictions and failures, the revolution represented a genuine advance in human freedom and dignity. It established that people have the right to govern themselves, that government exists to serve the people rather than the reverse, that individual rights deserve protection, that all humans possess inherent dignity and equality. These principles, imperfectly realized but clearly stated, became aspirations for people everywhere seeking freedom and justice. The American Revolution has been mythologized, romanticized, and simplified over 2.5 centuries. The stories we tell about it often obscure the messy, complicated reality. Understanding what really happened requires separating myth from fact, examining what we get wrong about this pivotal moment in history. Let's explore the myths that have grown around the revolution and contrast them with historical reality. Myth number 1. The revolution was universally supported by colonists fighting united against British tyranny. Reality: the population was deeply divided. Historians estimate that about a third of colonists actively supported independence. A third remained loyal to Britain. and a third tried to stay neutral or switched sides depending on circumstances. This wasn't a united people rising as one against oppression. It was a civil war that tore communities and families apart. Support for independence varied by region, class, and circumstance. New England was strongly patriot. The middle colonies were divided. The South had substantial loyalist populations, particularly in the backcountry. Urban artisans and merchants often supported independence, but so did wealthy planters. The war wasn't simply rich versus poor or coast versus frontier. Loyalists weren't all British officials and wealthy elites. They were farmers, craftsmen, shopkeepers who genuinely believed remaining in the British Empire was best for America. Many loyalists fought bravely for their beliefs and suffered terribly for being on the losing side. The revolution succeeded not because everyone supported it, but because the patriots were slightly more numerous and better organized than the loyalists, and because Britain couldn't suppress resistance across such a vast territory. Myth number 2. The Minutemen were expert marksmen who could shoot the buttons off a British soldier's coat at 100 yards. Reality: most American militia were poorly trained and often unreliable in battle. They were farmers and craftsmen who did some drilling on town greens but had no military experience. In major battles, militia frequently broke and ran when faced with professional British troops. Washington constantly complained about militia unreliability. Yes, some frontier hunters were excellent shots, but most colonists were mediocre marksmen at best. The famous image of Minutemen picking off redcoats from behind trees is partly myth. At Lexington and Concord, the Americans did use cover effectively, but they weren't all expert snipers. Many fired wildly and missed. The British casualties at Concord were significant but not overwhelming given the numbers involved. What won the war wasn't superior marksmanship but persistence, French support, and British strategic failures. The Continental Army that eventually defeated the British was trained to fight in European-style formations, not as individual sharpshooters. Myth number 3. The British were incompetent blunderers who lost through their own stupidity. Reality: British commanders were generally competent professionals who faced an almost impossible task. They had to suppress a rebellion across 3,000 miles of ocean, in a territory larger than Western Europe, against an enemy that wouldn't stand and fight decisive battles. British generals like Howe, Clinton, and Cornwallis were experienced officers who had won battles in Europe. They weren't idiots. They made mistakes, certainly, but so did American commanders. Washington lost more battles than he won in the early years. The British lost not because they were incompetent, but because their strategic situation was nearly impossible and because their opponents were more resilient than expected. British tactics were sound for European warfare, they just weren't always effective against American opponents who didn't follow European rules. Myth number 4. The revolution was fought for high principles of liberty and democracy by idealistic patriots. Reality: while principles certainly mattered, many people fought for more practical reasons. Some joined the Continental Army for the pay and land bounties offered. Some were drafted, some were social pressure to enlist. Some saw military service as a path to advancement they couldn't get in civilian life. Loyalists fought for what they believed were equally valid principles: loyalty to legitimate government, fear of mob rule, protection of their property interests. Many ordinary soldiers on both sides didn't care much about political philosophy. They fought because their friends did, because their communities expected it, because they needed the money, or simply because they found themselves caught up in events. This doesn't diminish their sacrifice. But it's important to understand that the revolution wasn't just about high-minded ideals. It was also about practical interests, personal ambitions, community pressures, and the chaos of war sweeping people along. Myth number 5. The Founding Fathers were secular men of the Enlightenment who founded a secular nation. Reality: most revolutionary leaders were religious, though their beliefs varied. Washington, while not particularly devout, believed in divine providence and attended church. Adams was deeply religious. Many revolutionaries saw God's hand in their cause. Religious language permeates revolutionary documents and speeches. However, the founders were also influenced by Enlightenment, rationalism, and determined to prevent religious conflict. They created a government with no religious test for office and, in the First Amendment, prohibited establishment of religion. So America was founded by religious men who created a secular government, a nuanced reality often simplified to fit modern political arguments. Myth number 6. All the Founding Fathers opposed slavery and planned for its eventual abolition. Reality: many founders owned slaves, including Washington, Jefferson, and Madison. Some, like Franklin and Hamilton, opposed slavery and worked for abolition. Others, particularly Southerners, defended it. The Constitution protected slavery through provisions like the Three-Fifths Compromise and the Fugitive Slave Clause. The founders kicked the slavery question down the road, unable or unwilling to resolve it. Some probably hoped it would die out naturally, but they didn't take strong action to make that happen. Jefferson wrote eloquently about liberty while owning over 600 enslaved people throughout his life and freeing only a handful. This contradiction was obvious even then. Samuel Johnson asked mockingly, "How is it that we hear the loudest yelps for liberty among the drivers of Negroes?" The founders weren't unified in their views on slavery, and many who opposed it lacked the courage to fight it effectively. Myth number 7. The revolution was a guerrilla war of farmers hiding behind trees and rocks picking off British soldiers. Reality. The decisive campaigns involved conventional warfare with armies maneuvering and fighting pitched battles. Saratoga was won through conventional battle. Yorktown was a formal siege. The Continental Army trained to fight European style, standing in lines and exchanging volleys. Yes, the battles of Lexington and Concord involved militia using cover, and the Partisan war in the South had guerrilla elements. But the revolution was won primarily through conventional military operations, not guerrilla warfare. The image of Minutemen hiding behind stone walls is powerful but represents only a small part of how the war was actually fought. Myth number 8. The Declaration of Independence made America independent. Reality. The Declaration announced independence, but independence had to be won through 8 years of war. Declaring something doesn't make it real. The British didn't accept American independence until they were forced to through military defeat and diplomatic negotiations. The Declaration was a crucial statement of principles and a propaganda tool, but it didn't create independence by itself. Myth number 9. Valley Forge was the worst suffering the Continental Army endured. Reality. Valley Forge has become symbolic of revolutionary suffering and conditions that were certainly terrible. But the army faced equally bad conditions at other winter encampments like Morristown, which actually had worse weather and supply problems than Valley Forge. The focus on Valley Forge in popular memory is partly because it came at a crucial time after defeats at Brandywine and Germantown, and partly because it's where the army was transformed into a professional force through training. But it wasn't uniquely terrible compared to other encampments. Myth number 10. Paul Revere rode alone, shouting "The British are coming." Reality. Revere was one of several riders spreading the alarm that night. He didn't shout "The British are coming" because colonists still considered themselves British. He warned that the regulars or redcoats were marching out. He never reached Concord, being captured by a British patrol. Another rider, Samuel Prescott, actually completed the mission. Revere's ride became famous because of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's 1860 poem Paul Revere's Ride, which took liberties with history for dramatic effect. Myth number 11. The Boston Tea Party was a spontaneous protest. As reality, it was carefully planned and organized by the Sons of Liberty. The participants rehearsed and coordinated their actions. They disguised themselves as Mohawk Indians, not randomly but as a symbolic statement and to obscure their identities. The destruction of the tea was methodical and controlled, not a wild riot. It was political theater designed to make a point, executed with precision. Myth number 12. Americans won because they were fighting for freedom while the British were fighting for tyranny. Reality. Both sides believed they were fighting for legitimate principles. The British believed they were maintaining lawful authority and defending the integrity of the empire. They saw the colonists as subjects who had duties and obligations, not just rights. From the British perspective, the colonists were selfish rebels who wanted benefits of empire without paying their share. Many British people sympathized with American grievances, but believed armed rebellion wasn't justified. The Americans believed they were defending their rights as Englishmen against unconstitutional acts. Both sides thought they had right on their side. Myth number 13. The revolution immediately created a democratic paradise. Reality. The immediate post-war period was chaotic and difficult. The government under the Articles of Confederation was weak and ineffective. The economy was in shambles. Social tensions were high. It took the Constitutional Convention in 1787 and years of political development before the United States had a stable, functioning democratic system. And even then, that system excluded women, enslaved people, Native Americans, and poor white men without property. American democracy was a work in progress, not an instant achievement. Myth number 14. The revolutionaries were selfless patriots who asked nothing in return for their service. Reality. Many revolutionary leaders were ambitious men who sought wealth, status, and power. Washington was one of the richest men in America and saw military service as a path to greater glory. Hamilton was a poor orphan who used the revolution to rise to power and influence. Many officers expected to be rewarded with land, positions, and prestige. This doesn't make them villains. Ambition and patriotism aren't mutually exclusive. But the revolution wasn't just about selfless sacrifice. It was also about opportunity, advancement, and power. Myth 15. Everyone who signed the Declaration of Independence suffered greatly. Reality. While some signers did face losses and hardships, many prospered during and after the revolution. Some became wealthy through war contracts. Some used confiscated loyalist property to expand their holdings. Some gained political power and influence. Yes, some lost property and even lives, but others did quite well. The narrative of universal suffering among the signers is exaggerated. Understanding these myths and realities doesn't diminish the revolution. If anything, it makes it more impressive. The revolutionaries weren't superhuman heroes without faults. They were complicated people with mixed motives, making difficult choices in impossible circumstances. They created something unprecedented despite their limitations and contradictions. The revolution succeeded not because everyone was noble and united, but because enough people, for whatever reasons, fought hard enough and long enough, and because circumstances favored them. The real history is messier, more complicated, and more interesting than the myths. It reveals human beings struggling with momentous decisions, making mistakes, learning from failures, and somehow managing to create a nation and establish principles that would outlast their own imperfect application of them. The revolution's greatness lies not in myth but in reality. Flawed people accomplishing extraordinary things and establishing ideals that future generations could work toward, even if the founders themselves fell short. We've reached the end of our journey through the American Revolution. We've seen how it began with protests over taxes, exploded into war, survived near defeat, and ultimately succeeded in creating an independent nation. We've examined the battles, the leaders, the sacrifices, the costs, and the legacy. But there's one more crucial question to answer. Why does the American Revolution still matter today, over 240 years later? The answer is that the revolution set in motion processes and established principles that are still working themselves out in American society and around the world. The revolution isn't just history, it's a living force that continues to shape the present and future. Let's explore why the revolution remains relevant and what its unfinished business means for us today. The most obvious reason the revolution matters is that it created the United States, which became the world's most powerful nation and a dominant force in global affairs. Without the revolution, there's no United States, no American Constitution, no expansion across the continent, no American role in world wars, no Cold War victory, no current American influence. World history for the past 2 centuries would be completely different. Every American living today is affected by the revolution. Your citizenship, your rights, your government, your freedoms, all trace back to what happened between 1775 and 1783. The revolution established the political framework under which we live. But the revolution's importance goes deeper than just creating America. It established principles that remain contested and incompletely realized. The Declaration of Independence proclaimed that all men are created equal. That principle has been fighting its way through American history ever since, expanding to include people the founders never intended. When the revolution ended, that equality didn't extend to enslaved people, to women, to Native Americans, to propertyless men, but the principle was stated, and once stated, it couldn't be contained. The abolitionist movement appealed to the Declaration's principles to argue against slavery. If all men are created equal, how can some be held as property? The contradiction was glaring. It took a civil war to resolve it, and even then only partially. African Americans gained legal freedom but not true equality. For another century, they faced segregation, discrimination, and violence. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s explicitly invoked the revolution's principles. Martin Luther King Jr. spoke of the promissory note of the Declaration of Independence, the promise that all men would be guaranteed life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. He argued that America had defaulted on that note for black citizens. The fight for racial equality continues today. Still working to fulfill the promise made in 1776, the women's rights movement similarly appealed to revolutionary principles. The Seneca Falls Convention in 1848 produced a declaration of sentiments modeled on the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident in that all men and women are created equal. If the revolution was fought for equality and natural rights, why were women excluded? The suffrage movement eventually won voting rights for women in 1920, but legal and social equality remained elusive. The feminist movement of the 20th century continued fighting for women's rights in employment, education, reproduction, and all areas of life. That struggle continues today around issues like equal pay, representation in leadership, and control over their own bodies. Native Americans invoked the revolution's principles too, though with more irony. The nation founded on principles of liberty and self-determination had dispossessed and oppressed indigenous peoples. Native activists have fought for recognition of treaty rights, sovereignty, and dignity, pointing out the hypocrisy of America celebrating independence while denying it to native nations. LGBTQ Americans have appealed to revolutionary principles in fighting for equal rights and recognition. If all people are created equal and possess unalienable rights, those rights can't be denied based on sexual orientation or gender identity. The marriage equality movement succeeded by arguing that equal protection under law, a principle rooted in revolutionary ideals, requires recognition of same-sex marriages. Every movement for expanded rights and equality in American history has appealed to the revolution's principles. Those principles, imperfectly applied in 1776, created a standard by which America could be judged and reformed. The revolution established that people have rights that government must respect, that equality is a fundamental human condition, that freedom matters more than order or tradition. These ideas remain powerful and contested today. The revolution also established the principle of government by consent of the governed. This sounds simple but has profound implications. It means government legitimacy depends on popular support, that people have the right to change their government, that authority flows upward from the people rather than downward from rulers. This principle is why Americans expect to vote for their leaders, why peaceful transfer of power matters, why government officials are accountable to the public. It's why corruption and authoritarianism outrage us, because they violate the principle that government serves the people. The revolution's principle of consent faces challenges today. Gerrymandering, voter suppression, money in politics, misinformation, all threaten genuine consent of the governed. When government doesn't truly represent the people, when some voices count more than others, the revolutionary principle is violated. Fighting to preserve and expand genuine democratic participation continues the work the revolution started. The revolution established the idea that written constitutions should limit government power and protect individual rights. The Constitution with its Bill of Rights created a framework that balances government authority with individual liberty. This balance remains contentious. How much power should government have? When does government authority infringe on individual rights? These questions are debated constantly in courts and politics. The Second Amendment, the Fourth Amendment's protection against unreasonable searches, the First Amendment's protection of speech and religion. All these generate ongoing controversy about where to draw lines between government power and individual freedom. The revolution began partly over resistance to unlimited government authority. That resistance remains part of American political culture. Americans distrust concentrated power and demand government justify its actions. This can make American government less efficient than more centralized systems, but it reflects revolutionary principles about limiting government overreach. The revolution established religious freedom and separation of church and state as fundamental principles. The First Amendment prohibited government establishment of religion and protected free exercise. This was radical for its time and remains contested. What does separation of church and state mean in practice? Can government funding go to religious schools? Can religious symbols be displayed on public property? Can religious beliefs justify exemptions from generally applicable laws? These questions are still being worked out 2 centuries after the revolution. The revolution proved that colonial peoples could overthrow imperial rule and govern themselves. This example inspired independence movements worldwide. In the early 19th century, Latin American colonies threw off Spanish rule. In the 20th century, colonies across Africa and Asia gained independence, often explicitly referencing the American example. The revolution showed that empires weren't permanent, that colonized peoples had the right to self-determination. This principle reshaped the world, ending the age of European colonial empires. The revolution's principle that people have the right to determine their own government remains relevant. When authoritarian regimes suppress their people, when colonial or imperial powers deny self-determination, people invoke the right to govern themselves that the American Revolution exemplified. The revolution established patterns of American power and its relationship to the world. Americans inherited from the revolution a sense of mission, a belief that America represents something special and has a responsibility to promote freedom and democracy globally. This belief, sometimes called American exceptionalism, has driven American foreign policy for better and worse. It inspired opposition to fascism and communism. It also inspired interventions in other countries that were sometimes misguided or hypocritical. The tension between America's revolutionary ideals and its actions remains. Can America promote democracy abroad while struggling with it at home? How can America champion human rights given its own failures to fully realize them? These questions go back to the revolution and its incomplete fulfillment of its own principles. The revolution established America's complex relationship with military force and civilian control. The revolutionary generation feared standing armies but learned they needed military power to survive. They established civilian control to prevent military dictatorship. These principles remain fundamental. Americans debate how much to spend on defense, when to use military force, but generally agree that civilian leaders must control the military. The revolution taught that military power must serve political purposes determined by elected leaders. This lesson remains vital in an age of sophisticated military technology and ongoing global conflicts. The revolution's economic legacy remains contested too. The founders disagreed about economic policy. Hamilton wanted strong government involvement in economic development. Jefferson preferred limited government and an agricultural economy. These disagreements continue. Should government regulate the economy actively or leave it to market forces? How should wealth and opportunity be distributed? The revolution established American preference for private enterprise and individual economic freedom. But debates about the balance between freedom and equality, between markets and regulation, continue. The revolution's legacy regarding slavery and race remains America's deepest unfinished business. The founders' failure to abolish slavery led to civil war and created racial inequalities that persist. The revolution proclaimed equality but accepted slavery, creating a contradiction America is still trying to resolve. Every conflict over racial justice, from Reconstruction to civil rights to Black Lives Matter, traces back to the Revolution's incomplete application of its own principles. The Revolution established America as a nation of immigrants. Though this wasn't initially intended, the revolutionaries saw themselves as Englishmen defending their rights. But independence created something new, a nation defined by principles rather than ethnicity or tradition. Anyone could become American by embracing American principles. This opened America to waves of immigration that transformed the country. The Revolution's principles meant America couldn't be defined by race or religion or ancestry. It had to be defined by ideas. This made possible the diverse multi-ethnic democracy America became, though achieving genuine inclusion for all groups remains incomplete. Today's debates over immigration, over who is truly American, over how to balance diversity with unity, all connect to the Revolution's establishment of a nation based on ideas rather than blood. The Revolution established tensions that define American political culture: liberty versus order, individual rights versus collective good, federal power versus state sovereignty. These tensions were present from the beginning and remain today. Should gun rights or public safety take priority? Should religious freedom allow discrimination? Should state laws or federal laws prevail? These aren't easy questions, and the Revolution didn't provide clear answers. It established a system where these tensions would be worked out through democratic processes, through debate and compromise, and constitutional interpretation. The Revolution created not a finished perfect system but a framework for ongoing negotiation of these fundamental tensions. The Revolution also established the possibility of peaceful reform. Despite deep disagreements, Americans have generally resolved conflicts through constitutional and legal processes rather than violence. The Civil War was a catastrophic exception, but most of American history has involved peaceful political change. This is remarkable and traces to the Revolution's establishment of stable democratic institutions and the rule of law. The Revolution proved that people could create government deliberately, could write constitutions, could establish institutions based on principles. This made peaceful reform possible. If government is created by human choice, it can be reformed by human choice. You don't need violent revolution to change injustice. You can use the tools of democracy, voting, advocacy, legal challenges, constitutional amendments. This faith in peaceful reform has made American democracy resilient. So why does the Revolution still matter? Because it set in motion principles and processes that remain incomplete. The work of creating a society based on equality, liberty, and self-government continues. Every generation faces the challenge of applying revolutionary principles to new circumstances. The founders couldn't have imagined modern technology, global terrorism, climate change, artificial intelligence, but the principles they established remain relevant. Do people have rights that government must respect? Does government require consent of the governed? Are all people equal? These questions matter as much today as in 1776. The Revolution matters because it established ideals that America continually struggles to achieve. We haven't yet created the society the Revolution promised. Equality remains incomplete. Liberty faces constant threats. Self-government requires eternal vigilance. But the Revolution gave us the tools and principles to keep working toward these ideals. The Revolution matters because it showed that ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things, that established powers can be challenged, that new and better societies can be created. It demonstrated that people aren't doomed to accept the world as it is, but can shape the world as it should be. Every movement for justice and reform draws on that revolutionary spirit. The Revolution matters because its story, properly understood, teaches important lessons. That achieving freedom requires sacrifice, that unity doesn't mean uniformity, that principles matter even when applying them is difficult, that leadership requires character, not just talent, that long-term vision matters more than short-term advantage, that flawed people can still accomplish great things. As we face contemporary challenges, the Revolution offers guidance. How do we balance security and liberty? How do we create unity amid diversity? How do we protect rights while maintaining order? How do we govern ourselves wisely? The revolutionary generation struggled with these questions too. Their solutions weren't perfect, but their commitment to finding solutions through reason, debate, and democratic process provides a model. The American Revolution isn't over. It's an ongoing project, a continuing effort to realize the principles proclaimed in 1776. Every generation must fight to preserve and expand liberty, to make equality more real, to keep government accountable to the people. The price of freedom, as revolutionary leaders understood, is eternal vigilance. The Revolution succeeded in winning independence and establishing a republic, but creating the just, free, equal society it promised remains unfinished business. That's why the Revolution still matters. It's not just history, it's the foundation of ongoing struggle to create a better world. The Revolution's true legacy isn't what was accomplished between 1775 and 1783. It's the principles established then that continue inspiring people to fight for freedom, equality, and justice today. When you stand up for your rights, when you demand government accountability, when you fight for equality, when you work to make society more just, You're continuing the revolution. The shots fired at Lexington and Concord in 1775 truly were heard round the world, and their echo continues today. The American Revolution wasn't the end of a story, but the beginning of one. A story still being written, a promise still being fulfilled. That's why it matters. That's why we remember. And that's why the struggle continues.